We're going to give it probably another minute. I see folks are still joining the Zoom webinar, so just hold tight for another minute. I think we're going to get started here. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we continue our discussion that will inform the long-term plan for light-duty vehicles and clean transportation equity investments. My name is Raquel Leon, and I am the staff lead over the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, or Cbrp, as well as this effort to update the long-term plan. I'm joined today by Lisa McCumber, who's the manager over the funding plan, as well as Cbrp and financing assistance for lower income consumers program. We are joined as well by a great panel of ZEV experts who will be providing some information today at the beginning part of our presentation. Before we get started, I do want to go over some logistics for today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We do anticipate a copy of the recording to be made available on the Low Carbon Transportation Investments Meetings and Workshops webpage in approximately 2 weeks. Materials for today's workshop, including the agenda and slides for all presentations, are available on the same webpage, and I've dropped a link to that webpage into the Zoom chat. In addition, we will be leveraging Zoom's raised hand and Q&A box features to facilitate comments and questions today. If you would like to submit comments or questions in writing, please use the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will address policy-related questions verbally for the benefit of all attendees. If there are Zoom disruptions for any reason, including malicious intent, we will immediately end today's meeting and send out another notice to reschedule. And lastly, we are unable to allow anonymous meeting participants for security reasons. So please make sure your name is clear on the Zoom platform. If you have called in, we will adjust your phone number and call on you if you raise your hand based on the last 4 digits of your phone number. So now that we have that covered, I'll start off by providing a quick summary of our first workshop that was held on February 10th. So in this first workshop, we provided a snapshot of the ZEV market in California. Some key takeaways were that the ZEV market has been rather resilient throughout the last couple of years, and plug-in electric vehicles have grown in market share to over 12% last year. Given current data, it also appears that we are well on track to meet the next ZEV sales deployment goals of 1.5 and 5 million EVs. Now, while the light-duty vehicle market as a whole is still experiencing lingering pandemic-induced impacts to production and supply, it is also evident that there's still a significant incremental cost when choosing to go electric. So this, combined with the current economic situation and continued need to reduce emissions, it is important that we focus our efforts on providing access to clean transportation for all Californians, be it through supporting electric vehicle adoption, providing access to cleaner mobility options, and the availability of a cleaner transit system. So with that in mind, today we will focus on how we continue to build a sustainable and equitable EV market here in California. In previous iterations of our long-term plan, we have utilized the diffusion of innovation theory as a guide to determine when we might achieve a sustainable EV market. So based on this theory, staff have defined the self-sustainable ZEV market as a state of the market where broad incentives are not required to increase ZEV adoption. A self-sustaining market is expected once the California new ZEV market share reaches about 16 to 20%. The market has reached the early majority segment, and there is enough demand to help market mechanisms take over and drive the market. In addition to this market share target, staff through the public process have also identified a number of additional market metrics that are essential to the success of a sustainable EV market. This includes annual ZEV sales numbers, diversity in available models, consumer awareness, and battery and vehicle costs. So today we have a panel of ZEV experts that will elaborate on market sustainability in a number of ways. First, we will hear from Courtney Copeland with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, or GOBIZ, who will discuss the administration's ZEV goals and various ZEV efforts that are underway. Then we will hear from Steve Douglas with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, who will be discussing EV model diversity in the new EV market, how that compares to the internal combustion engine market, and providing insights on some new affordable EVs that are expected to hit the market in the coming years. Following Steve's presentation, we will hear from Liz Najman with the Recurrent Automotive, who will be discussing statistics on the used EV market in California and providing some insight on how it might change in the coming years. Then we will hear from program administrators and some CARB staff leads for our various vehicle purchase incentives, which include Cbrp, Clean Cars for All, and both the statewide and local financing assistance programs. These conversations will center around participant characteristics and lessons learned, so we can get a better idea of who is currently utilizing our programs, where there are gaps, and how we can address those gaps going forward. Following each presentation, we will have a short Q&A period for clarifying questions, and we ask that all other questions and comments be reserved for the discussion period later on in today's workshop, or submitted in the Q&A box where we will handle them later on during the discussion period. After these presentations, we will have a short break and return to have a panel discussion based on what we've learned and how we can improve our programs going forward. We will use a list of questions that can be found on the second page of the agenda to help guide the discussion, but we will also have the floor open to questions and comments from meeting participants. So before I turn it over to our first panelist, I want to check to see if there are any questions. If so, please use the raise hand function in Zoom or press #2 for those calling in, or submit your questions via the Q&A box on Zoom. My colleague Aria Berliner will be managing the Q&A. So Aria, are there any raised hands at the moment?
No, there are not.
So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first panelist, Courtney Copeland with GOBIZ.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Just a moment while I get up and running here. Okay, always that moment of, am I sharing the right window? You should see a slide that has California and our bear on it. Can we verify that I've got the right slide up? Beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm excited to kind of help start us off today. My name is Courtney Copeland. I'm an analyst with the Zero Emission Vehicle Market Development Team at GOBIZ, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. And I'm really excited to talk with you today about the state of the light duty ZEV market and how it fits into the broader picture of meeting our state's ambitious goals to curb climate change, reduce air pollution, and support an equitable transition to zero emission transportation. And a lot of what I'm going to be doing today is kind of stage setting. I can give you a little glimpse at some of the topics that the other panelists are going to be diving into in more detail. Really quick, I would like to give just a reminder of GOBIZ, as somebody who personally is still relatively new to working with the state of California. I was previously in the nonprofit sector. I know I appreciate it when I get to learn about other agencies, so I try to do the same. GOBIZ is kind of an eclectic team, and we try to be the one-stop shop for those who want to do business in California. So we serve as the state's leader for job growth, economic development, and business assistance efforts. We've got a number of different units. There's the business development unit. It has 2 teams. There's CalBiz that helps with incentive navigation and can do site selection for those who might, companies might want to find a manufacturing facility or relocate an office. And then within that, there's also the a team of permitting experts. So that's one unit within GOBIZ. We also have international affairs, and these folks liaise with, trade ministries, for example, or international companies who want to have a presence in California. And, we deal with incoming and outgoing trade delegations. I said we're eclectic. We've also got small business. So we provide, there's the Office of the Small Business Advocate that provides support to local startups and helps connect them to small business development centers in their areas. Kind of going clockwise around my slide here, there is iBank, the Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, and they do lending for public infrastructure and private development. There's a number of initiatives, but the ones most relevant today include the Clean Center, or California Lending for Energy and Environmental Needs, and then the recently launched Climate Catalyst Fund. And then that brings us to the Zero Emission Vehicle Market Development Unit, or we often just say the ZEV team. And our job is really to try and build the zero emission vehicle industry and broader ecosystem in California. What can we do to scale zero emission vehicles and the supporting infrastructure and supply chains? How can we increase investor confidence and access more capital? And what can we do as the state and as various agencies and regulatory bodies and whatnot to enable the private market to advance our goals here in California? And as well, we work on consumer awareness and ultimately changing the behavior, right? So that people are making that choice to ride or drive in a zero emission vehicle. See if I can advance my slide the way that I want to. There we go. Now, back in 2020, GoBiz was tasked with developing a zero emission vehicle market development strategy. This was part of Executive Order N7920, which set the ambitious ZEV goals that we're working toward today, among other goals that had been set earlier and many more that I'm sure will be set in the future. You can find the strategy and the executive order on our website, along with related documents and updates for business.ca.gov. And I'm happy to share out information as needed. And you can see, some of the goals here, and the one most relevant to our discussion today of light duty vehicles is that 100% of in-state sales of new passenger cars and trucks will be zero emission by 2035. Thanks for bearing with me while I navigate all my various tabs I've got open. So to return to the zero emission vehicle market development strategy, it's centered around 4 market pillars that you'll see here kind of in the middle of the graphic. There's the vehicles, infrastructure, end users, and workforce. And the pillars all have to go together. They support one another, and if one fails, the entire system fails. And then they are all built on 5 core principles that you'll see in the bottom of the graphic. There's equity in every decision, embracing all zero emission pathways, so various different technologies, collective problem solving, public actions that drive private investment, and designing for system resilience and adaptability. Each metric and objective and collective problem solving action in the ZEV strategy maps directly back to at least one of those 4 pillars: vehicles, infrastructure, end users, workforce, as well as to the investments required to build them and the outcomes. You probably saw the outcomes at the top of that graphic, like reduced carbon emissions, improved air quality, economic development and jobs, and access to clean mobility. All these pillars and the principles and the outcomes are described in more detail in the full strategy, which also identifies lead agencies for each of the pillars. And the Air Resources Board, who's hosting this event today, is the lead agency on the 2 pillars I think most relevant to our conversation today: vehicles and end users. And just a quick note on how we define those in the strategy. Vehicles we define as new and used, and plug-in electric and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. The strategy does encompass also, commercial vehicles, freight, marine, rail, and aviation. But for today's purposes, I understand we're focusing on light-duty passenger vehicles. And then the people who drive them, the end users. These are riders, drivers, consumers, dealers, companies, fleet operators, and more. And these pillars, really do go together. It's key for the vehicles to make it into the hands of the end users. Again, thanks for bearing with me as I have to click between my various windows here. So California is committing to major investments to make this happen. I'm sure you've seen the news about it. The California Comeback Plan budget, which was passed back in 2021, included $3.9 billion over 3 years. And then the proposed California Blueprint will add another $6.1 billion over 6 years Of course, it still has to be passed, but if it is passed, then that'll total $10 billion over 6 years. And we're not going to go over all of the budget items today. I'm sure a lot of you have been on budget workshops or maybe heard the ZEV team's Deputy Director Tyson talking about the budget. But I do feel it's worth focusing in on the share allocated to passenger vehicles. So you'll see that right there at the top of that blue graphic. Let me get a closer view of that. There we go. So both the comeback plan from last budget year and the blueprint proposed now include $1.2 billion for passenger vehicles. And you'll note a continued focus on equity when it comes to both vehicles and the infrastructure to support them. I anticipate we might hear more from other panelists from CARB on things like the Cbrp, Clean Cars for All. And additionally, the comeback plan allocated $5 million to ZEV consumer awareness, and that has gone to GoBiz to award 2 grants that we just made the awards for earlier this year for programs that will be running over the next 16 months. And I believe we'll be hearing from one of those grantees later today. If we have Veloz on, please forgive me if I'm not correct on that. All righty. That's a bit of the background about GoBiz, about the ZEV strategy, and about the investments that is helping to move it along. And I want to talk a little bit more now about the nitty-gritty of, okay, what are we actually doing? The specifics of our shared work, how GoBiz contributes to it, and the state of the market for zero-emission vehicles. GoBiz, we engage in at least a 2-way flow of information. I feel like it's information flowing many ways, but at least 2 ways in terms of we try to get useful information out to stakeholders. That's other state agencies, that's industry, that's consumers, that's local jurisdictions and companies. So we try to get that information out through our website and through liaising with other agencies to coordinate. We publish resources like our permitting guidebooks. We have a hydrogen station permitting guidebook as well as a EV charging station permitting guidebook, which will be updated later this year. And we've updated our funding resources guide. We often drive people toward, the CEC, for example, for manufacturing grants, or to any of the other agencies that are providing, support on infrastructure and vehicles and on access. And I also mentioned, providing regulatory navigation assistance to companies that are looking to problem solve in California to work in a streamlined way, I suppose. And then in terms of the other direction of the flow of information is we try to learn as we go. And so we're tracking progress towards state targets. You'll see the multicolored map there. That's our permit streamlining map, where we track the status of local jurisdictions and whether they have streamlined EV charging infrastructure processes in place. And then what I'm going to talk a little bit more about, you'll see on the far end of the slide, is our market metrics snapshot. And we're trying to pull all this information from many sources, get a high level view so that we can learn, we can adjust our strategy. And I should have specified the ZEV strategy has about a 3-year term, so we are required to renew it after 3 years, but we consider it a living document, and we are very much about learning as we go. And we're trying to take information in and learn from it. And so that brings us to the ZEV market metrics snapshot, which is new and now posted to our website. And this is where I have to click over. All righty. And this is something we've been in the works for a while that we're excited to share, even though there's so many metrics to choose from. There's so many numbers and so many pieces of information and so many ways to try and share the story of ZEV market development in California. And we've only got room to pick a few things, but we're doing our best to bring something useful together. And this document, it's gonna be quarterly. This is our first one. And for now, we've just got the 4 pillars. I'm gonna scroll really quick. We've got vehicles, we have our end users, infrastructure, and workforce. Future iterations, we hope to bring in additional information about the outcomes that I mentioned, like the air quality and the economic development. as well as bring in some more information about equity and access. But to get to the topic at hand today and to preview what I think you're going to hear more about from other panelists, let's look here over at light-duty passenger vehicles. And of course, our target in the strategy is to have 100% of new sales be ZEVs by 2035. And with data from the CEC as well as from Veloz, the electric vehicle market report, we can see the change in market share over time. We're up above 12% now, but we've got a lot of growing to do if it's going to be 100% by 2035. As far as vehicle models available, I want to say the last number I saw was 87. I know we get updates on that quarterly. I'm sure it'll change. There's been over 1 million zero-emission vehicles sold in California to date. And we've got what I believe is the largest used ZEV inventory in the nation. And to bring this now to consumers, those are our vehicles. We've got the vehicles, we have them available, they're being sold. Consumer awareness is really important. And I looked at some research from Consumer Reports. This is back from 2020. There are some more recent surveys, but this is the most recent where I could find results both for California specifically and for the broader nation. And within California, 26% of people surveyed said that they definitely planned to buy an EV for their next car. And in that same year, the nationwide number was 4%. I know the nationwide number's up now closer to 10%, but that really shows that in California, people have a positive attitude about buying an EV or another zero emission vehicle, be it a battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. And the model availability is an important factor about that. Recently, there was research out from Auto Pacific from the fuel price impact study. And the indication there was that consumers actually tend to stick with their preferred vehicle model, including trucks and SUVs, even in the face of rising gas prices. Most people are not readily going to abandon their vehicle of choice for something radically different. And so if we want to get everybody into ZEVs, the solution is not to get an SUV driver into a sedan, it's to come up with a zero emission SUV. And so that's why this growth in model availability is so important. And earlier, I think Raquel mentioned the importance of price point, and I believe Recurrent's going to talk about that later today, because the availability of used vehicles at an affordable price is key to ensuring adoption, equitably and universally across California, especially among lower income Californians. And in a lot of folks in the places where affordable, easy to maintain vehicles that are reliable are extremely important, as is improving the air quality. You can see other metrics on here. We try to capture state investment in getting people into ZEVs through the voucher and rebate programs that I'm sure you'll hear about a bit more later. Infrastructure is key, and that's something that we're doing a lot of monitoring on to ensure that people are able to fuel their cars, that they know how to do it, that they have the confidence that they're going to be able to get where they need to go and not get stuck somewhere. And the ZEV workforce is really part of the broader ecosystem of having a sustained and self-sustaining industry. This is something that we're continuing to develop. We're working with folks in other agencies to clearly define, what the parameters are of, what is the ZEV workforce and how do we define and measure that. So that's about everything I had prepared for today. Like I said, it's really a preview to help set up what you're going to hear a lot more about. And I'll leave it at that or let it go to questions. I'm sure I might have skimmed over something a little bit quickly.
Thank you for that presentation, Courtney. And we will open it up for a few minutes if there are any clarifying questions on what Courtney presented. Arya, are there any raised hands?
There are no raised hands.
All right, well, thank you. I guess I will stop my share for now, and I'm very eager to hear from the other panelists that can dive more into some of these topics that I had the pleasure of introducing.
Raquel, we do have a comment in the Q&A box. It's kind of a broader comment. So Courtney, it's not directed necessarily to you. It's kind of more of a comment for CARB to consider. So I'll read the comments for the benefit of those unable to view the Q&A box. And the comment comes from Evan Edgar. ZEVs are not zero emissions, but have a carbon intensity of 62 to 90 grams. So sorry. And the energy required to produce the electricity to charge the battery is 23.39 grams per CO2, plus the range of the emissions from the battery manufacturing alone, assuming a 100,000 mile lifespan, have a carbon intensity of 38.13 to 66.26 grams per CO2 mile, depending upon the type of the ZEV battery. CARB needs to be honest and use the life cycle analysis for BEVs for true sustainability and to include global, social, and environmental impacts. Thank you for the comment, Evan. And as we continue to do our analyses on how we conduct our emission reduction calculations, we'll definitely take this into consideration.
Now we'll move on to our next panelist. We'll be hearing from Steve Douglas with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. We'll be providing some information on the new EV market.
Great. Thank you, Raquel, and thank you, Lisa. And thanks for the invitation today. And I really want to thank you not only for the invitation today, but also for your years of work on the incentive programs. And you know, you've been more than generous with your time and quite honestly, your patience in many cases. So we sincerely appreciate that. And in fact, the incentive program, at least on the light duty side, which I represent, has been the most successful in the country. So I think almost, as Courtney said, almost half the vehicles sold in the US have been sold in California. That's in large part because of the Cbrp program and because of the comprehensive nature of incentives, infrastructure, and things like that in California. So with that, model diversity and upcoming EVs. So I first want to touch on the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. We represent 37 different companies, including the car companies that produce about 95% of the new vehicles that are sold in California. We also represent the world's leading tier 1 suppliers and the technology companies. So let me start with this. A couple of years ago, we started looking at what are the barriers to electrification, broad electrification. And by broad electrification, I mean, 30, 40, 50, 70, 100% electric vehicles. And of course, with electric vehicles, I'm talking about fuel cell vehicles, battery electric vehicles, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. We kind of landed on 4 major areas: the infrastructure, the home, workplace, public charging, hydrogen fueling, the cost. And this is not just the cost of the vehicle, which is important and critical, but also the cost of the fuel, because people are not going to buy cars that are vastly more expensive than to either purchase or to fuel than the cars they have today. So that's on the cost side. On the production side, this is not something that's it's the purview of the Air Resources Board, but of course, none of this happens if we don't have the critical minerals we need to produce batteries, if we don't have the factories to produce those batteries, if we don't have the trained labor supply, and just in general, the supply side security, which I think you're seeing already, or today is because of the pandemic and because of the chips is short, and there is a consequence to that. So finally, that brings us to the customers, and customers need to be not only aware of the technology, but they need to be comfortable with that technology. So that's one element. The convenience, it has to be as convenient as the vehicles that they're used to today. And then finally, what we want to talk about and what I was asked to talk about is the choice and capability, and that is critical. And so from the auto innovators, the electrification is our focus, and all of these areas have to be addressed, and certainly choice and capability is chief among those. So a few notes on models and and market on models and market segments or vehicle segments. So you see it a lot, and sometimes model is, so they will have, a model will be one that has 19-inch wheels, and then another one will have 20-inch wheels. So those are two models. Some will be long range, some standard range. That will be two models: all-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, front-wheel drive. So all of these different models. And in fact, for what I tried to do today is just to say, hey, if it's the Ford Mach-E, for example, it's the Ford Mach-E. That's one model, and it doesn't matter if it's the long range or the standard range, the all-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, or the rear-wheel drive. So that's how I try to do it with the models. Second, models, and this is consistent across the industry. They come and they go. Models introduced, and a few years later they may go away. Or in some models are announced as, and like I said, that's the future model predictions, but they're not always accurate. And the further out you go, kind of like the weather, the more uncertain the model predictions are. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes there's production delays, sometimes there's market shifts, sometimes there's economic shifts. The economy goes bust or goes boom. Some companies go under before they produce vehicles or during production. And then sometimes companies shift their focus. There was a couple, like the Bollinger had planned on a couple of vehicles, and that was what they planned in January. And then they decided, no, let's stick to commercial market and skip the retail market for now. So those were announced, they were never produced. And then, of course, if you see an increased demand, then for a specific segment or model, then that's where companies go. So, which kind of brings us to the fourth point, and that's that customers don't chase automakers. So, that it's not that the automakers can put ads on and everybody will rush and buy that car. The automakers chase the customers. And so when you see like a category like the compact SUV market that was relatively small 5 or 6 years ago, it just boomed, and you saw the number of models just take off in that category. And that was not because manufacturers said, oh, let's draw customers to that. It was because customers were demanding that, and so companies, automakers reacted, and they started building vehicles in that category. So with that, the model availability, this is a little historical model availability. I put the source for the data and the footnotes in most of these slides. So, and this is where we are. We started in 2010, there weren't any electric vehicle models. In 2011, there were 4, and I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader to figure out which 4 of those were. And then, in 2022, we were about at 63. I think we're up to about 70 now. And then we expect that to ramp up over the next few years to somewhere around 100, I believe it's 130. Yeah, 130. So that's the expectation. I think what you'll see in the coming slides, that's probably not too far off. So that's our kind of prediction on the EV model availability. So the next thing is I pulled the California market share by segment. And this is over time, and I'm using the California New Car Dealers Association Auto Outlook. That's a really good resource. There's a link here to it. And I used, this is 2012, and then these are all 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. So there is a 5-year gap between the blue and the orange. But you kind of see what's happening. Trucks are up a little bit. Small cars are way down, half of what they were in 2012. So a decade ago, they dropped in half. Non-luxury SUVs, those have jumped, 50% from 20 to 34%. Luxury SUVs have jumped from 6 to 15, so almost tripling in their sales. Luxury sports cars have dropped from 12 to 9%. and then mid-size cars, large cars, they've dropped as well. So that's all been taken up by this SUV sector, and to a tiny extent the trucks, but mainly the SUV. And a lot of these non-luxury SUVs are compact SUVs. So then what I did was I took it, because Lisa and Raquel had asked, like, well, how do the EV model compare to the ICE, the gasoline or gasoline primarily models? So this kind of shows in the blue, those are the ICE, and as you might imagine, there's many, many more models in the ICE. On top of that, I laid, though, the 2021 market share for each one of these. And so there's some belief that if you just produce more models in that, then you'll get more market share. But of course, if you look over here at the luxury sports car, that represents only 9% of the market, and yet there are 133, almost twice the number of the next highest category. So just having a bunch of models doesn't necessarily drive the market share. And the same thing, the non-luxury SUV market has about 75 luxury SUV, and yet the market share is pretty dramatically different. And then on top of this, I put, and I didn't include, I included the hybrid, but I didn't put the number there, but the gray and the yellow are battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So in the small car market, 7 and 7, at SUV 7 and 9, that's growing. I mean, there's a reason that the Tesla model came out with the Model Y and SUV, or Mustang, the Mach-E, or Toyota has the RAV4 Prime. So a lot of activity in the SUV, and that's because that's where the customers are. And the same thing in the luxury SUV market, lots of different models between the and Hyundai Ioniq is another one that's in the SUV market. And then of course the luxury sports cars, those are large numbers for the electric vehicles. So finally, I'll just wrap up, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are just a list of the future EV models, and I pulled these directly from Car and Driver, but I thought it was kind of interesting, and I put these in alphabetical order, and I kind of wish I would have sorted them differently, and then the estimated MSRP, these either came from they came from US Car and Driver. Obviously, we don't have a lot of these. Don't have the pricing hasn't been announced on a lot of these, but you can see it's crowded in the SUV, the pickup market, and that's a fair number of pickups are coming out. So the Silverado, the Canoe, the Ford, GMC Silverado, Rivian is coming out with one. And so I think that, and of course the Tesla Cybertruck. So just a lot. I would say on these that, again, use caution with future product plans. We don't, as an association, we don't ever discuss future product plans within the company. So that's why I pulled these from Car and Driver. So that we have them. And also I would note that if you see a number like 40,000, that's probably way too round, and probably that doesn't represent what will be the actual, well, it certainly doesn't represent what will be the actual price. So, and that's true with all of these, 40,000, 41,000, 200,000, 56,000. So, when they come out, and when you have numbers like 58,750, that's probably closer, and it may have even been announced. So, and the same thing, it's 41,669, probably announced. And these are typically base price. So, and then finally, I just wanted to point out, and I include this in the presentation, we have a lot of references that I think is really good. We have the EV dashboard. This is a nationwide map, and you can click on it, you can adjust the date, you can go by total vehicle sales, you can go by market share, you can select a state, you can select a region or a technology, you can select multiple states, and I think it's handy. We developed it I don't know, 7 years ago, maybe it's CSE updates it and they put it together, and then we use data from IHS market for that. And then we have the Get Connected EV report that's put out. We put that out quarterly, and it has a lot of data on sales, and it has a lot of data on infrastructure and things like that. Reading the media, and just in general, a lot of these are valuable resources, so I'll put them on there. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was a great presentation. I think we'll open it up for a few minutes to see if there are any clarifying questions on the material that Steve just presented. Aria, do we have any raised hands? I don't quite see anything in the Q&A box yet.
Yes, Raquel, we have one raised hand from Mark Roost. Mark, I have unmuted your mic.
Thank you. So what I noted was the minerals appearing to be critical the way you were talking about. And what's missing is the idea that minerals can be substituted. And that's our business, is substituting minerals for other metals, especially. So that's basically it, just to put out there that lithium, cobalt, nickel, that whole lithium batteries can be substituted with non-lithium, and neodymium for motors can be substituted, and all of these things will eventually show up.
I think, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that was it. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, Mark, and that happens over time, but that tends to take a fair number of years, 5, 10 years to develop, because there's a lot of, going from the lab to the vehicle and making sure that it's durable for 150,000 miles or however long a vehicle will run, making sure that it operates in Death Valley in 120 or 130 degrees, as well as Pikes Peak.
Yeah, well, all of that can be done in 1 year. A lot of it is, it needs to be developed, and basically someone needs to fund the development. And if you guys wanted to have these technologies in 2 or 3 years, there have been already decades of research on them. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, no, and again, I appreciate that, but we are spending, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars doing research and development, and I think the auto manufacturers around the world have a very vested interest in reducing the price of batteries and reducing the price of vehicles and motors. And to the extent there's technology and that will, or minerals or different materials that will improve the performance, that are smaller, a lot cheaper, then I think it's in everyone's best interest to do so. And I think the companies that I work for, and the ones that I don't, are doing that work. And so, and I think there's a lot of hope for, in the future.
Thank you.
Yep.
It looks like,
comments.
oh, sorry. It looks like there are no more raised hands.
We'll move on to our next panelist. We will hear from Liz Najrin with Recurrent Automotive, who will provide some information on the used EV market in California as well as in the US.
Hi, and I'd like to thank Raquel and Lisa and Aria for having me here today. I'm really excited to have a chance to speak with everybody. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview about Recurrent. We're a pretty new startup, so I'm sure most people have not heard of us yet. I will then talk a little about customer attitudes towards used EVs and a little bit about EVs in general. And then I will talk about the state of the used EV market in California. And I apologize, I didn't really speak too much to the larger market in the US, but we do have a lot of resources available on our website. Let's see, does this, hold on one second. I advance my slide. Give me one moment. Ah, there we go. Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. So a brief intro about Recurrent. We are a pretty early stage startup that works to increase confidence and transparency in the used EV market. And our premise is that opposed to a combustion engine, which has lots of parts, an electric motor really only has a couple of dozen parts. And it's well known at this point that the most important and expensive part of an EV is the battery. And for many consumers, the EV battery is literally a black box. So we work to change that by collaborating with thousands of EV drivers around the country, pulling telematic data from their vehicles, and then we use machine learning to predict how vehicles age. Specifically, we look at range degradation, and we use that as a proxy for battery health. So we, in addition to market research and a lot of writing and general research, we produce battery reports, vehicle reports. There are two examples of sections from that on the screen. And our reports are not really designed to be a definitive solution to battery or vehicle health. And they can't be because we, at this stage, mostly rely on telematic data, but they are designed to answer common questions that we hear from EV shoppers and owners, such as, how is my car doing? What's the real world range today? How will that range change in different temperature or terrain conditions? And what will my range look like in 3 years from now? So we do focus on used EVs, and a question we get sometimes is why? And there are a couple of answers to that. The first is, quite simply, more than 70% of the cars on the road today in the US are used. So it's impossible to meet any sort of climate or emissions goals without having a large portion of those used cars be electric. Secondly, as pointed out by a comment earlier, most of the emissions for an EV are production related, and kind of regardless of how your energy is produced, the production is the largest emission source for an EV. So that means the longer you can have them on the road, the lower the average emissions is going to be. Thirdly, there are still a lot of accessibility barriers to going electric, particularly for lower and middle income. For a new vehicle, the average ICE price is $46,000 versus $56,000 for an EV. And when you look at the used sector, the average for an ICE is $27,000, and that's compared to $39,000 for an electric. We did relook at that number, removing sort of luxury EVs and very new EVs. So removing anything from the current year and removing anything above 80,000. And that does bring down the average price of a used EV to 33.7 thousand, which is a little closer, but it's still a barrier. Finally, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about this today, there are few point of sale incentives for EVs, and nationwide, at the very least, if you're relying on the federal tax incentive, it requires a purchaser to be able to sort of have the purchase price of a car up front and rely on having enough tax liability to get that $7,500 back at the end of the year. It's not always that useful for lower or middle income shoppers. And finally, there are very few states that have incentives on used EVs. And I know that California has some great programs for that, but it does remain a barrier for adoption and for the growth of the used EV market. So EV technology wouldn't be a big deal if it was just an upgrade to, the turbo engine or a new sort of driver assistance. But EVs are physically different, and it seems like shoppers and drivers really do understand that. Everybody walks around having a mental model of their cell phone, and we all know that after a year and a half or 2 years, the battery really stops working very well. You always have to have it plugged in. And so there's a lot of anxiety around the longevity and the performance of lithium ion batteries in cars. And couple that with the understanding that batteries really are the cost center for an EV. This slide shows data that comes from an energy company who surveyed their customers about concerns when buying an EV. And the sort of like dark purple shaded bars are all battery related concerns. And that includes the distance on a single battery charge, concerns about battery life, not knowing where to charge, unsure about performance, and concern about resale value. And these are all kind of in the sphere of battery usage. In our own research, we found very similar themes. Charging and range were the two most cited concerns for EV purchase. And in fact, the largest wish list item that shoppers have reported to us is having certainty on battery health and range. And while certainty may be a bit of a stretch, we hope we can provide some information. So when we look at kind of dive into Recurrent's own research on shopper attitudes a little bit more, we have learned that drivers do know that the battery is the most important cost and element of an electric vehicle. But we find that especially for used car shoppers, there's no heuristic to replace the kind of wisdom of the odometer that really reigned supreme for so many years in the used market. Similarly, used car shoppers often look for maintenance records, and with electric vehicles, those can be much fewer and farther between, especially for a newer model. We have noticed, interestingly, that our site traffic has doubled in the past few weeks with the increased gas prices, and most of that search traffic is coming to us for searches on battery replacements and used EV warranties. So that kind of sheds a little bit of additional light into what's going on with people whose minds are turned towards electric vehicles right now. The last thing I'll point out on this is that I found a really interesting discrepancy between what new EV shoppers who have never owned an EV want and what current EV owners who have liked their EV enough to go look for another one want. And whereas somebody who's never owned an EV is really going to be looking for battery health and range information, once you've owned an EV, if it works for your lifestyle, EV owners looking for a new EV prioritize price, incentive, and rebate. And so that kind of lets us know that once you've had an EV, you're no longer worried about battery health or range. And that's really, it's an opportunity for education about the EV experience and something that most people move on from pretty quickly. The final thing I'll talk about here is the elephant in the room in terms of new shopper anxiety, and that of course is range. I'm sure we've all heard a lot of people say that they're waiting until range is reliably above 400 or 500 miles per charge, citing all sorts of road trips and emergency errands. And in truth, this is a chart of, this is data from actual California drivers in the Recurrent fleet. And this is their average miles per day. Tesla drivers drive the furthest, and they're just pushing 30 miles a day. And BMW and Volkswagen drivers have the shortest ranges, under 20 miles a day. But the takeaway here is that really nobody is driving as much as they think they are. And it opens the door for a lot of older used EVs that have shorter ranges, but are no less reliable cars. And so Recurrent really works to try to get the message out that, that range, people don't need the range they think they do. I will caveat this chart by saying that we are a pandemic era startup. So the data we have is from pandemic drivers. It's unclear exactly what the effects of pandemic daily driving have been. I think we can all take a guess. And that there have been reports, I think Car and Driver had a study that came out last year showing that EV drivers drive 30 to 50% less on average than ICE drivers. Again, the cause and effect there is a little bit of a question. Are EV drivers driving less because they're worried about range, or are they saving longer road trips for other cars? So those are some sort of outstanding questions about this data. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the used EV market in California, with a few caveats about our data, which we get from a partner. We focus largely on inventory numbers rather than sales. And that has to do with the way our partner gathers data. The sales numbers are aggregated in thicker time chunks. So there's a little less granularity. We get sales data only in 3-month chunks whereas we get inventory data every month. And all of the numbers here are for EV and plug-in hybrids only. So there are some more caveats to some of the numbers I'll show you, and I'm happy to take those in the questions. All right, so unsurprisingly, California leads the nation in terms of used plug-in EV inventory. And it generally hovers over the past year around 25% of the used plug-in inventory in the country. It's also around 25% in terms of used sales. Second and third are reliably Texas and Florida. And then after that, the states kind of hop around a little bit. The data in this chart is from the end of the year. And I know that in more recent data, New York has, I think, bumped up to 4th place in terms of used EV inventory. And as a New Yorker, I love that. But the states that are on that chart kind of remain in the mix in the top 10. And again, we do know that used sales numbers in California hover around 25% of the country's used EV sales, but they are harder to pin down exactly. And these are just for dealer listings. So private sales, unfortunately, we have no way to really capture those. So this slide kind of touches on the average used EV prices in the top EV inventory states. And good news is that the average price in California tends to be much lower than in other states. It's particularly interesting when you look at Oregon and Washington, neighboring states, which have higher prices. Washington on average is $3,000 more, and Oregon is $7,000 more. And both Texas and Florida, the sort of next highest inventory states, also have higher averages. When you look at the average sales price, however, California happens to be straight at exactly at the median value. It's the 25th highest or the 25th lowest. So just for some context, the most expensive used listing in California as of now, used listing, is a 2021 Tesla Model S, and that's at the bargain price of $170,000. And the least expensive used EV is a 2014 Volt, going for just under $8,000. And we do a lot of analysis about vehicles that can be found under $20,000, $25,000, $30,000, and we publish that out with some regularity. And in general, the models that you'll find for really budget used EV purchases include older Leafs, older BMW i3s, Fiat 500Es, Ford hybrids, and the Toyota Prius plug-in. And again, going back to the issue of range, these older vehicles will tend to have lower ranges than a lot of newer cars. But that being said, if we go back and think about the fact that nobody's really driving over 30 miles a day, all of those EVs would easily satisfy that. So the question that you may have right now is why is the listing price in California so low? And my guess is that it's because California has a slightly higher percentage of older EVs. And this is because a lot of EVs are first released in California. California has a really great incentive program, and there's a lot of sort of marketing and PR to get people into EVs in California. The other thing I'll point out two more things on this slide. In my own research, I draw a line between 2018 and 2019. 2019 really being the model year where vehicles reliably get over 200 miles of range on a charge. And even a used 2019 will still reliably get over 200 miles on a charge. 2018 and earlier vehicles were not reliably in that 200-mile sweet spot. And finally, there's this interesting trend that we've been seeing and we'll be publishing about soon, where more in the rest of the US than in California, there's this spike in inventory in 2021 used EVs. There are more 2021 EVs for resale than 2019 or 2020, which is kind of wild. And we think what's going on here is that given the price inflation in the used EV market in the past year, a lot of shoppers who had delivery of an EV in late 2020 or early 2021 saw demand skyrocketing and were able to resell their EV, their new used EV at a hefty profit. So finally, just to talk about the California inventory by model, Tesla rules the land. They have 42% of the used inventory, which is less than the estimated 65 to 70% of the entire US EV share, but it's not insignificant. Non-Tesla battery EVs include the Leaf, the i3. There's still no Bolt EV listings in California after the recall. And it's unclear whether that is due to vehicles that have not yet had their batteries replaced or people holding on to those recently replaced battery cars. And 40% of the inventory in California right now are plug-in hybrids. So you see the 530e, the Ford Fusion, the Prius Prime are all up there, and the Volt, of course. In terms of sales numbers, for the period between November and January, we have our numbers show around 9,000 sales of used EVs, with the top models being the Model 3 at around 16%, the Volt at 12%, the Model S and the Leaf both at 8%, and the i3 at 6%. And that about wraps it up. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, Aria, do we have any raised hands?
We do. Just as a reminder to all callers, please state your name and affiliation when asking questions or making a comment. We have Jonathan Changus. Jonathan, I've unmuted your mic.
Great, thank you. Liz, Jonathan Changus with the Center for Sustainable Energy. That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you for sharing. I may reach out afterwards. I have tons of questions, but for the purpose of today, I'm curious, do you guys track or do you have any insight into the new cars that are purchased in California that then leave on exodus to other states and don't end up becoming used cars in California? There's some data on the CEC's website that talks about new sales and cumulative sales versus what's currently registered. So it looks like some cars are going somewhere, but I was wondering if you have an ability to track that.
We, other than sort of anecdotal point-by-point data of drivers in our fleet who let us know that they've moved, we don't have any sort of robust data on that. I know it's a question that I've discussed with some of the other panelists on this call before. I'm not sure how we don't really see registration data. So we're working on getting information. We're working on trying to understand information about past vehicle location, which may be a way we could get at that, but we don't quite have that in place yet.
Great, thank you. That's kind of what our experience has been as well. And I think we're trying to answer the question about, do states that have used EV rebates draw vehicles out of state or not? And that's, I think, an important question to answer as we're trying to figure out what should happen here in California. So thank you again for your presentation. Yeah,
and just the brief research I've done seems to show that a lot of the rebates require proof of residency. Or a home address that you can use. There are other people who can certainly speak more to that. But I would love, if you have other questions, please send me an email. I'd love to chat more.
Thank you.
Are there any other raised hands?
There are no more raised hands.
Okay, I don't see anything in the Q&A box. So thank you, Liz, again for that presentation. That was great information on the used EV market. I know that it's growing, so there'll be more data to come, but it's great to see it.
Thank you.
Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and hear from our program administrators, and we'll kick that off by hearing first from Dr. Brett Williams with the Center for Sustainable Energy, who is the program administrator for Cbrp.
All right, thank you very much. Sharing screen now. How does it look?
Looks great.
Great. So thanks for having me back. And thanks also to my co-author who joined me on this journey to dive deep into the Cbrp data again. And thanks to the others back at CSE who supported this effort. My name's Brett Williams. I'm what's called the Principal Advisor for EV programs. And I heard once some good advice, and perhaps you'll recognize it. And that is, if we could first know where we are and whether we are attending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. So today, let's see what the Cbrp data can tell us about where we are and whether we are attending when it comes to the characteristics of consumers receiving rebates. So the goal here is to add the consumer to this perspective of market sustainability and progress forward. So as always, I like to give you your money's worth. So the handout includes many more slides than I'll be able to touch on today, including several that provide important context. The two primary purposes of today are to characterize what happened, where the funding went in 2020, and then to use that similar set of data to sort of help us think about the path forward from there towards mainstream EV markets. And if that hasn't satisfied your appetite for data and program evaluation, there's plenty of linked sources in the handout as well that you can look at your leisure. So last time I spent a lot of time on context, I won't spend as much time on this, but I do want to just verbally remind us all that in 2020, as now, the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program had an income cap, an MSRP cap, and a minimum electric range requirement. All of these things do affect the characteristics of consumers that receive rebates. So for example, you might think of it, you might not realize the minimum electric drive capability, the minimum electric range capability, carved out some of those high performance luxury tuned plug-in hybrids that Steve showed on his market share slides. So those are no longer in the program at that very low end. So keep that in mind. The one other piece of context I did want to sort of show dramatically here is the cliff that the program and indeed all economic activity fell off of during the period we are examining in these slides, which is 2020. There was significant recovery. We've heard a lot about how EVs fared, all things considered, pretty well. But the question remains when it comes to consumers, who made it back into the market in 2020 and who maybe didn't yet? Okay, so who received rebates? To answer this question, we're going to look at the most recent edition of the Cbrp Consumer Survey available, and specifically the third chunk of that, which is 4,300 survey responses, which we've statistically weighted to better represent 26,000 program participants who either purchased or leased an electric vehicle in calendar year 2020. And the way the survey editions got switched over to the one that's currently running, we actually did miss out on December, so it's almost 2020, but we'll just call it 2020 for the slides moving forward. And indeed, it does present the most recent picture publicly available of the program. And here's an old favorite, the income distribution of rebate recipients. And if you look at the first three columns, you can see that 66% of funding went to households with incomes less than 150,000. And that is up from 64% in 2019. So last summer, we put on the web a data brief characterizing 2019 data. We're now showing you the 2020 data. At least the whither we are tending is in the right direction. And that may seem like a modest progression, but actually keep in mind that is despite COVID. We don't have a great sense yet of who stayed out of the market in 2020 and is maybe waiting to get back into it, or maybe is not in a position to get back into the new car market. It's also despite the fact that during 2020, Cbrp's income cap remained constant. So maybe the institution of that MSRP cap at the end of 2019 helped this progression forward. Maybe it was the overall trends in the EV market despite COVID. So in order to understand whether that's good, bad, or otherwise, we can see most of the rebate funding went to folks at the left side of this chart, the low to moderate income folks. But how do we judge? How do we really think about these data? In order to do that, it's critically important to come up with an appropriate baseline of comparison. So here we see data characterizing the California new car buyers, the best we could do with data available. It's pretty tricky to come up with data like this, actually. But you can see that 66% of funding on the last slide went to approximately 68% of the market, according to these data. So a pretty close matchup, actually, perhaps much closer than many of you might have expected if you've heard a lot of the concerns typically raised about EVs and EV rebates typically benefiting more wealthy white men, that sort of mythology. Well, that's starting to break down in the most recent data, and it's also a function of this baseline, right? We'll get into that in just a second. Let's switch to that concern, which is at the high end of the income distribution. And the first thing we must realize is the new car market, like it or not, 56% of it lives in households with income more than 100,000. So that's a market dynamic reality we have to deal with. Compare that to 59% of funding for these 2020 purchases and leases. Again, pretty similar. And the columns actually surprised me how similar they ended up being from this funding perspective. I'm going to actually switch from funding. Keep in mind that lower income consumers are eligible for larger rebates, increased rebates. If we switch simply to the look at the number of rebates, the gap widens a little bit. So 66% of rebates went to households with income over 100K, but those rebates less than that received more money. And the reason I'm switching, I actually think the funding perspective is the more appropriate perspective for this conversation, but a lot of the calculations we have are based on the percent of rebates, and it acts as a conservatism, right? We don't want to, say there's no challenges remaining on the income front for EVs and EV rebates, particularly given the price increases we've seen with COVID, right? So let's take that 66 versus 56 comparison from the previous slides, and let's put it on a table with a lot of other characteristics. And these are all characteristics that are defined. Each row is defined in terms of a majority characteristic for the new car market. So the new car market, the majority of new car buyers are greater than 40 years old. The majority of new car buyers selected white race. And so the question is, are EVs and rebates disproportionately benefiting folks even more so than whatever structural inequities already exist in new car buying? And this gives us a way to start judging that. Well, unfortunately, a lot of what I'm seeing out there is folks are using census data, and census data is, it's a reasonable first step. It's available. It's less tricky to get a hold of than the new car buyer data. But unfortunately, if you look at the columns, the green column for new car buyers in the middle and the gray column for census data on the right, none of the numbers are remotely the same, except for that very last characteristic, the even split between male and female sex gender. So unfortunately, using census data can be misleading. And a lot of the sort of blogs and media coverage and some research reports do rely on that census data. So let's look at kind of the impact of relying on census data by breaking it down into the two steps. So if you look at the distance from 38% to 66% for income, for example, 2/3 of the difference that's being talked about is actually attributable more to new car buying, and 1/3 of the difference, or 36%, is more attributable to something that's more particular or unique to EVs and EV rebates. So this kind of helps us decompose what isn't necessarily understood with those findings, that about 2/3 of that finding really is characterizing something not particular to EVs. And kind of bringing the other characteristics to the party in the table, I've ordered it with Nick's help, starting with characteristics at the top that primarily have to do with the differences between census data and the new car buyers. And then by the time you get to the bottom, we're talking about characteristics that primarily have to do or entirely have to do with the uniqueness of the EV market. And so these are the real distinguishing characteristics, so to speak, as you go down that table. So let's make it a little bit easier to see that in the next slide. So keep in mind, census data is great, but it isn't always an appropriate comparison for a new car incentive program, for example. Let's return to that difference we've been highlighting all along, that 10 percentage point difference. And let's take the percentages away and just focus on the differences. So this is a sort of quantitative metric of the road ahead from where EV adoption is today to where we might want it to be when EVs go mainstream. And we're not just going to stop there. We're going to talk about steps along the way to mainstreaming EVs and beyond to priority populations. But certainly that is an important milestone, and it kind of speaks to market sustainability as well. And you can more clearly see the differences are smaller at the top, much larger at the bottom. We've thrown some heat map coloring on that to sort of double down on it. And I'm going to return to this in just a second, but there is one more slide I wanted to show before I do that. And that is this slide about the population, or the EV adopters as a whole was one column in all my previous slides. And at Nick's suggestion, we actually broke this into the two pieces we like to do. And it was a very good thing we did that, because you can see, for example, for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, the income metric is already lower than that for the new car market as a whole. And further, for those metrics that tend to be at the bottom of this chart that have more to do with the unique characteristics of the EV market, plug-in hybrids represent sort of a progression on the way to the mainstream. So this presents kind of an interesting dilemma. We heard last time that plug-in hybrids are cost-effective ways to reduce greenhouse gases, and here that they represent this sort of characteristic progression. Well, they have other trade-offs. They have emissions. They have cold start emissions. Eventually, we of course do want to get beyond combustion, but this makes the consideration of this technology a little bit more complicated when we think of it not just in terms of the end goal, but the path there and the different technologies and segments that are involved. And more to the point, it's just a way to say not all EV adoption is the same. And so we're actually going to flip to that perspective and talk about how different strategic segments of the EV market can actually inform a little bit of the path forward. So if that's where we are, we have a quantitative sense of the road ahead on each of those rows, each row telling its own story. What can we do to amplify specific promising parts of EV adoption that will help us progress these consumer characteristics and EVs towards the mainstream? So far, all I've been doing is talking about those blue columns, which represent the program as a whole. And you can think of the better we understand existing adoption, which is already working, the better we can reinforce that. We can pick those low-hanging fruit, add lots of EVs quickly to the market in the near term, and accelerate the market towards the mainstream. But of course, eventually we're going to run out of those low-hanging fruit or pre-adapted enthusiastic consumers. So we need to, and we need to do it now for equity reasons, push the boundaries of the EV market, expand the frontiers of the EV market. And so the ways we're looking at that is we're focusing on certain subsets that if we amplified it would have valuable characteristics in and of themselves. So if we focus on folks we call rebate essentials, those most highly influenced by the rebate to adopt, they're the opposite of free riders who would have bought the EV anyway, but thank you very much for the check. There's always those in the program. But if we at least focus our attention towards those rebate essentials, we'll be improving the cost effectiveness of the program and minimizing free ridership. Good idea to do that anyway. Similarly, we're looking at another group of folks which get at that sort of awareness gap that Dr. Karani at UC Davis and others talk about. And I know Steve showed some, or I believe GoBiz showed some indication that awareness is improving. But nevertheless, the vast majority of people have relatively low EV awareness, understanding, and serious consideration. So we can be overwhelmed by that, or we can get to working on that. And one of the ways we think we can work on that is let's examine those folks who had low initial interest at the beginning of their car search in electric vehicles, but who somehow did go on to adopt an EV. This is that sort of influenceable edge. Can we bring more people with low initial interest into EV adoption? The better we understand that, the more the market moves away from that enthusiastic core and into the mainstream. And finally, a very important segmentation exercise that we do is we define priority populations. In New York, they were defining their priority population in terms of disadvantaged communities. For these slides, we'll be looking at the folks who get that increased rebate for lower and moderate income individuals. And you can think of these folks who are a full range of EV proclivity and desire to adopt, but who are stuck behind a barrier. And we like to think of that barrier as a tough nut to crack, that once we break it open, unleashes the truly tasty market morsels and where we'll need to go to get to those 100%, not just for equity, but also to get to those 100% goals. So let's line those all up. All of those things we're doing for their own good reasons, but what does it mean in terms of these consumer characteristics? Just right now, the existing rebate essentials, the existing EV converts, the existing increased rebate recipients in 2020. Well, interestingly, they kind of line up in this sort of stepping stone pattern where we're progressing, getting some of the red off the board as we move from left to right and beyond to priority populations. Each of the rows, again, tell their own story, but if I were to sort of just total up the total journey ahead, the program as a whole has a 54 percentage point difference to make up to go mainstream. And I'm not saying 1 percentage point of age is the same as 1 percentage point of income, but I'm just trying to give us an overall sense of the distance between here and where we might want to be. Well, rebate essentials represent, if we amplified them to dominate the program, a reduction of almost half of the journey. They take us halfway there, 46% of the way. EV converts take us another 19, 20% of the way, 3/4 of the way. Increased rebate recipients take us as far past the mainstream as current adoption is shy of it. But it's not all uniform. Different rows have different stories to tell. Obviously, increased rebate recipients are about giving increased rebates to lower income consumers, so they get that green star in the income category. But even the best amongst them, the increased rebate recipients, stop their gender journey 16 percentage points shy of mainstream. So this gives us, again, just with a few concrete numbers, a little bit of pain, it gives us a way to sort of quantify the road ahead, to calibrate our understanding relative to new car markets, and to get a rough order of magnitude of those differences and kind of rank order the issues, so that then we can peel the conversation back another layer. So, okay, maybe it's not about white ethnicity disproportionately benefiting from Cbrp, but what lies underneath it? What's the next conversation? Adoption amongst Asian Americans is strong. Maybe it's not as strong amongst African Americans or Latinx folks. What does that mean for policy? Take that conversation the next step forward. Whereas other characteristics, it's more at face value, like home ownership and gender. So hopefully this is a tool and approach that sort of helps us have these conversations, empowers those conversations. Let me just kind of summarize some of what I've said so far. We've created a variety of metrics. Often these metrics, unfortunately, do paint a different picture than painted by census data. We've got some metrics where what we'll call in the ballpark, a shorter journey. We have some metrics which historically have been quite mixed, but are trending in the right direction and are within 10 percentage points, 3 percentage points if you think about it in terms of funding. And if you look at certain subsets like plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, they're actually already lower in that metric than new car buyers. But all of that aside, we have just kind of a snapshot on what happened in 2020. 2/3 of the funding went to 66% of the funding went to 68% of the market. Pretty close matchup. Some of that's probably because a lot of our expectations were set by those census data. And then we have some features that are pretty unique and in some cases pretty sticky when it comes to EV markets. The gender gap kind of persists across all 4 states that I've analyzed. It persists across time. And yes, we're chipping away at it slowly and steadily, but slowly and steadily from low levels to slightly less low levels at this point, at least in terms of who's answering our surveys. So we came up with these metrics to quantify the road ahead, which I described. And lastly, we kind of looked at this roadmap that kind of conveniently presents some ideas how if we amplify certain types of adoptions using policy, which are desirable for their own sake, like cost effectiveness, and very importantly, keeping our eyes on the ultimate prize of making sure that priority populations are integral to the transition to transformative transportation electrification. We also will see the progression in consumer characteristics that goes along with it. And we must do this, we must do it rapidly, we must do it responsibly, we must do it widely. So hopefully this presentation went some way towards informing efforts that will make some of this happen, each with their own individual goals, but ideally also collectively in conversation about what is important. And let me know what you found to be important, useful, less useful. And with that, I thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope this helps.
Great, thank you so much, Brett. We're going to turn it over to see if there's any questions, any clarifying questions on what Brett just presented. Are there any raised hands?
There aren't, but there is a question in the Q&A box. Natalie Nax asked, 66% of funding went to households of less than what?
Okay, let's go back to that slide, no problem. We got some links that are going to help us get it there. So basically this 66% is the sum of 17, 24, and 25. So we're just looking at a metric of adoption. The majority of EV rebates went to folks less than $150,000 annual household income. We flipped it on its head and looked kind of at what rebates were going to at the higher income levels, but this was just one way to sort of take this distribution and peg a number to it that then we could compare to previous years as a measure of progress and so forth and so on. So hopefully that answers the question. If I missed an aspect of it, feel free to follow up. And in fact, let me offer up my email on this last slide here. All of this is online already. But if something's important to you and you don't have an opportunity to sneak it in these clarifying questions, please do follow up.
Thank you, Brett. Raquel, there are no raised hands and no more questions in the Q&A box.
Well, thanks again, Brett. We're going to move now, shift gears to Clean Cars for All. And we'll be hearing from Anthony Poggi, who's the CARB staff lead over Clean Cars for All.
Anthony, you'll need to unmute your mic.
Thank you. I just was, can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
It's a
thank
little small though.
Okay, let me try something here. How about that?
Much better.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anthony Poggi. I'm the lead staff for Clean Cars for All. Let me exit out of this real quick and turn my camera on. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. Why? I'm sorry. There we go. And give me 1 second. I'm going to try to reshare and see if that fixes it. Okay, how's that? Can you see it? Sorry about that.
Anthony, we can't see it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But if it helps, I will share my screen and you just direct me. When...
That would be, yeah, I apologize. I'm having issues with it on my computer.
Okay, sorry everyone. Let me do this. Okay, and I'm sorry guys, it's in PDF form, so it's not as pretty as it normally would be. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for your help, Aria. I appreciate it.
No worries, just let me know when I go to the next slide.
Okay. So if you want to scroll down to the following slide, yes, thank you very much. So Clean Cars for All is administered through participating air districts and focuses on providing incentives to lower income California drivers to scrap their older, higher polluting car and replace it with zero or near zero emission vehicles. Options include the purchase of a new or used hybrid, plug-in hybrid, or zero emission replacement vehicle. Furthermore, participants can choose an alternative mobility option, such as an electric bike, a voucher for public transit, or a combination of clean transportation options allowed under the program in lieu of purchasing a replacement vehicle. Buyers of plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles are also eligible for home charger incentives, also known as EVSEs, or prepaid charge cards if home charger installation is not an option. Participants must have a household income of less than 400% of the federal poverty limit, which is $106,000 for a family of 4, and live in a zip code containing a disadvantaged community census tract. In addition, the program aims to focus the benefits to low income and disadvantaged communities and has a heavy emphasis on consumer protections, education of the new technologies, and coordination with other clean transportation programs. With this focus in mind, 88% of all projects go to households below 225% of the federal poverty limit, which is about $60,000 for a family of 4. To date, over 190 million has been allocated to the Clean Cars for All program. 75 million of this total is from the fiscal year 2021 to 2022 funding plan. The program has funded more than 12,000 vehicle replacement projects across 4 participating air districts, which include South Coast Air Quality Management District, San Joaquin Air Pollution Control District, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. Vehicle replacements include over 8,000 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and zero-emission vehicles. In addition to vehicle replacements, Clean Cars for All has also funded over 150 EVSE installations, and the availability of, or the implementation of charge cards has started in the last few months, and so we're seeing those projects roll in as well. CARB staff will be holding public meetings beginning April 11th, 2022 to discuss the proposals for a statewide expansion of the program. The solicitation for a statewide program administrator will be open around mid to late summer. Next slide, please, Aria. So on this slide, we're going to go over a little bit of statistics and trends we see amongst our program participants. The program's participants and household and vehicle statistics vary between each air district, but there are some trends we think you can see amongst all 4 air districts currently administering the program. The program is designed to allow the administering districts to cater their programs to specific needs and demographics of their constituents. Household size varies for our participants between 2.5 people in the Bay Area to just over 3 in South Coast. South Coast have on average the lowest income of any of our air districts. Low-income households, which are classified using income, household size, and the county, make up 92% of program participants, with the highest participation rates in Bay Area and South Coast. The average age of our retired vehicles is around 22 years old, with San Joaquin Air Pollution Control District retiring the oldest vehicles on average. And that 22 years is more of a recent statistic, but yeah, it's about 22 years old for the vehicles that are being retired through the program. Replacement vehicle choices are shown by percentage of the federal poverty level of the participants. Vehicle choices between income levels are fairly consistent between those with household incomes below 225% and those between 225 and 300%. Participants with an income between 300 and 400% cannot receive a Clean Cars for All incentive for a conventional hybrid. And similarly to other income levels, they choose a plug-in hybrid vehicle above all other options. For a family of 3, the threshold for a 225% federal poverty level is about $49,000. And for 300%, it's about $65,000. Program performance data such as this is used to develop the program analysis and goal setting report, which I will be going over next. Next slide, please, Aria. Also referred to as the AB 630 report, CARB releases an annual report that analyzes the performance of the Clean Cars for All program and sets new performance goals for the upcoming year. The report also showcases the achievements of the program, identifies areas for improvement, and illustrates the future direction of Clean Cars for All, such as statewide expansion. CARB also uses the report to inform long-term strategies like the 3-year plan for light-duty ZEV incentives. This report is developed through meetings with districts to incorporate operational experience, analysis of metrics such as application volume and participant survey responses, and stakeholder feedback. This ensures the report covers the Clean Cars for All program more holistically. Beginning with the fiscal year 2022-2023, the development of the annual report will be incorporated into the funding plan process. This will allow additional opportunities for stakeholders to provide input and help guide the direction of the program. And that concludes my discussion slides. And so I guess we'll open it up for Q&A. Raquel?
Thank you, Anthony. It looks like we have one question in the Q&A box, so I'll go ahead and read that off first. This is from Jonathan Changus. What is the proportion of new versus used replacement vehicles by air district program?
So program-wide, it's about 75% used to 25% new. And the last time I looked, that does not vary a lot between districts, but I can follow up, Jonathan, if you're interested. I can get you the district by district breakdown. And again, just to make sure, 75% used, 25% new.
Aria, do we have any raised hands?
We do. Christopher Chavez, I have unmuted your mic.
Great, thank you. This is Chris Chavez with the Coalition for Clean Air. A couple quick questions. One thing I am curious about, looking at the data for participant statistics, so I see the numbers that you referenced are also in the Luskin UCLA report, but the Luskin report states that the numbers are a little bit different when using the below 225 FPL definition, whereas the numbers that you quoted were more along the lines of low-income households with costs of living adjusted. So can you explain the difference between the two?
So the 225% FPL goes by the number of people in the household and the income. And I believe there are some other adjustment factors, but whether or not it's a low income household is obviously income, then household size, then county. I don't believe federal FPL does not go by county. So it's when I say low income household versus below 225% FPL, they are different metrics, but they're two different ones that we use. And again, the low income household portion incorporates the county of residence and the household size and the income. And I know for a fact that the federal poverty limit does not necessarily include county.
Okay, I think just one quick comment on that, and certainly you appreciate that information, and I'm not a statistician, I can't even pronounce the word by any stretch, so I appreciate that. I guess the different, the one thing I would just say is, each district takes a different approach to customer outreach and to folks who are trying to get folks to participate in the program. But the one thing I want I know that each program is different, how they reach to hard to reach populations, difficult to reach populations, and certainly would hope that there's some acknowledgement or some consideration that how different implementations of the program do different, are able to reach different types of populations differently. The other question, I know that we've discussed this multiple times, and I'm going to do a tweak to my usual question, which is about the 1099 issue. I know the air districts are the ones responsible from CARB's perspective about the issuing 1099s. We still want to see that issue addressed, but I think the more important question as it relates today is I know CARB is also considering statewide expansion of Clean Cars for All. So does CARB intend to issue 1099s in that statewide expansion process?
I can tell you that for any incentive program that we administer directly, we don't issue 1099s. I'm not going to comment on the actual, what the statewide administrator would and will be doing, just that we understand the negative impacts of 1099s. We also don't issue them ourselves. So take that for what it's worth for our programs. And again, we are working with the districts and federal tax agencies to seek further clarity on the issue.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other raised hands?
No, there are not.
Thank you, Anthony, for that presentation and providing that information on CC4A. Now we're going to hear from Jonah Valentine with Beneficial State Foundation, who is the program administrator for the statewide financing assistance program. Jonah.
Thank you. Let me get my slides up. Are these showing up all right for everyone?
Yes.
Great. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Raquel and CARB staff for organizing this and all the speakers. It's really been informative, and thanks for hanging in. I know we've had a lot of presentations. I'll try and be brief and welcome any questions after the presentation. My name is Jonah Valentine. I'm the program director for the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, and I'm happy to be here today to share some data and learnings from the first 2 pilot phases of the statewide Clean Vehicle Assistance Program. I'll begin with a brief overview of the program's purpose and its design. So the purpose is to decrease barriers to clean vehicle adoption among low-income communities. And these barriers include affordability, fair financing, and charging access. So we provide low-income qualified participants with vehicle grants up to $5,000 for either a new or used vehicle at the point of purchase. We partner with Beneficial State Bank to provide loans capped at 8% interest rate, even for credit challenged individuals. And finally, we provide charging access grants up to $2,000, and those that can cover the cost of a level 2 home charger installation or go towards public charging credit. The Clean Vehicle Assistance Program has successfully completed 2 statewide pilots. The program first launched statewide in June 2018, and in just under 6 months, over 3,000 people started an application. But due to limited funding, we did have to close the program in November 2018. And the team was able to award clean vehicle grants to about 450 of those applicants. Throughout 2019, the program was closed to secure additional funding, to increase staff capacity, and to streamline operations. And then in February 2020, we relaunched for phase 2 of the pilot. And despite the pandemic, interest in the program skyrocketed, and over 26,000 individuals started an application in the 13 months that the program was open. Also in that time, and past the open date of the program as well, we awarded $24 million in grants directly to lower income consumers in vehicle and charging grants. So to date, we've helped roughly 4,450 individuals and families make the switch to a clean vehicle. And we have demonstrated that lower income communities are very interested in clean vehicles, and serving them will be instrumental in creating an equitable shift to clean transportation. As a statewide program, it has always been an important goal for us to have a statewide reach. And every county in this map of California that is shaded blue has been served by the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program. The lighter blue counties show where the highest volume of our grantees reside. And as you can see, the largest demand has come from Southern California, and particularly Los Angeles County. Reaching disadvantaged communities, which I'll continue to refer to as DACs, has been another primary goal of the first 2 phases of the pilot. So far, we've served 600 unique DAC census tracts, which account for about 30% of all California DACs. About 19% of the CVA program grantees reside in a DAC census tract. And that's a figure that has trended downward in phase 2 of the pilot. And we're working to increase that through a outreach pilot, which I'll elaborate on in a couple slides. Finally, our data shows that on average, DAC grantees spend less on their vehicle purchase and have lower incomes than non-DAC grantees. So to dive into the data a little bit more on that last point, here's supporting data that illustrates how the demographics and purchasing trends of DAC grantees on the left and non-DAC grantees on the right compare. So across these metrics, vehicle cost, average income, average federal poverty level, and age, DAC grantees have slightly lower figures, as you see. What I think is most interesting to note here is that overall, all of our participants have very low incomes and have spent more on their vehicle purchase than perhaps one would expect from this group. Further analysis is needed, but this data should prompt us to remember the current realities of the clean vehicle market, as other presenters have touched on. Desirable clean vehicles are still quite expensive, especially lately. And we should also be open-minded to purchasing preferences and purchasing power of low-income households. For example, we see participants receive family support, and they put a high value in their vehicle's reliability and safety. So now I want to circle back to the outreach pilot I mentioned before. The goal of this pilot was to engage more DAC participants and provide increased technical assistance and financial coaching. By technical assistance, I mean supporting participants with low computer literacy and or limited access to computers or internet. And financial coaching includes loan readiness workshops and credit building counseling. So we partnered, starting in September of last year, we partnered with 2 community-based organizations, the MAC Project based out of San Diego and Central California Asthma Collaborative based out of Fresno. It was a closed pilot, so all participants came through these 2 partners, and we capped participation because of limited funding to only 150 grantees. Because of the small scale and targeted approach, we were able to ensure that 100% of applicants received in-depth EV and loan readiness coaching in personalized settings. The pilot is in its final stage of helping approved applicants purchase a clean vehicle, but I'll share some of the early outcomes we've seen so far. First, 30% of all applicants resided in a DAC community, which is a strong improvement on the trends we were seeing in phase 2. Additionally, 69% of applicants that started an application went through all the steps and completed their application. This is a 44% increase from the overall program conversion rate of 25%, definitely trending in the direction we want to see. And then so far we have awarded clean vehicle grants to 21 participants, and 134 applicants or approved applicants are still car shopping. And so over the next few months, we expect all 150 available grants to be redeemed. Additional learnings from this pilot came from surveys that every participant completed at the beginning of the application. So from these surveys, we learned that 59% of applicants stated a need for a vehicle within a month. So we see that there's high urgency around vehicle purchasing. We also learned that reducing environmental impacts and saving money are top reasons that participants want a clean vehicle. And then 89% of the applicants' current primary form of transportation is a traditional combustion engine vehicle. So high potential for greenhouse gas reduction. It's also important to share the individual participant stories because these best highlight the life-changing impacts the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program can have for participants. So this is Anthony. He works full-time as a security guard, and he wanted an EV but thought it was out of his price range. So when he heard about the CVA program from a coworker, he was very excited to apply, and he was able to get qualified and purchase a 2017 Fiat. So he said, I never thought I'd be able to afford such a new car with so few miles on the odometer while working a minimum wage job, but here I am. We have many stories like this, and just such incredible life-changing impacts through switching to an EV and getting that financial assistance and the grants. So to close, I'll briefly summarize some of the key learnings we have shared today. First, both phases of the statewide pilot showed very high interest and demand for the CVA program grants. And so we know that there are tens of thousands of individuals, if not more, who are excited about clean vehicles and probably just need a little bit of help from the CVA program or other incentive programs to make the switch to clean vehicles. We learned from the outreach pilot that this targeted approach with case management support results in higher participant engagement and more DAC applicants. We also learned that longer and more flexible timelines are key to supporting these higher need individuals, particularly those with the highest credit challenges. And finally, analysis of our participant demographics shows that on average, DAC grantees spend less on their vehicles and have lower incomes than grantees with that 300 to 400% federal poverty level income, who tend to spend more on their vehicle purchases and reside less often in DAC communities. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and you can follow the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program through these channels.
so much, Jonah. I'm going to turn it over to Aria to see if there are any raised hands.
There are no raised hands, but we do have a question in the Q&A box from Jack Fleck. Why is the interest rate 8%? Couldn't it be closer to current bond rates, e.g. 2 to 3%? Doesn't the car serve as collateral for the loan, i.e. income and credit score shouldn't be an obstacle?
I can touch on some of those questions. Thank you. So the interest rate is set at 8% based on the kind of moderate credit interest rate in the market. So for prime borrowers with really good credit, the interest rates are for auto loans here. So we're auto loan interest rates. So it is possible to get lower 3-4% interest rates with prime credit. But for poor credit borrowers, interest rates around auto loans skyrocket up to as much as 20%, 17%, 15% is even considered normal. And so by capping interest rate at 8%, which is kind of a mid-range interest rate, we're particularly poised to help those who have poor credit and would otherwise in the market be qualifying for 15 to 20% interest rate loans. So we can cut those folks' interest rate in half or more. So that's how we ended up at the 8% interest rate, not by, if an individual participating in our program has a strong credit profile, they can definitely secure a lower interest rate, but that offering is poised to help those with the largest credit challenges the most. And then the vehicle as collateral point, the underwriting practices of banks and credit unions differ, and but we work with Beneficial State Bank, and they definitely take into account the vehicle that the applicant would like to purchase. And so an older vehicle with more miles on it would provide a riskier loan and for the participant as well, whereas a newer vehicle with less miles would provide kind of a stronger profile for the lending. So the vehicle is definitely taken into account, but for consumer protection, the underwriting process is important to evaluate loan readiness to make sure that folks are set up to succeed in their loan.
Okay, Aria, are there any other raised hands?
There are not.
Okay. All right, thank you again, Jonah, for that presentation. And now we'll move on to our last panelist, and that's Vivian Rawanji with the community, with CHDC, I'm sorry, the Community Housing Development Corporation, who's the program administrator for the Local Financing Assistance Program. And Vivian will be providing some insight into CHDC's experience of running a high-touch case management approach to EV incentives.
Thank you, Raquel. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Lisa and team, for inviting us to speak at this very important workshop. I'm going to preface this by saying that Jonah, which is BSF, and CHDC run the same program, but we run it on the local level. We started this out in 2015 within 6 counties. And so what Jonah said about the program is the same, but what I'm going to do is center my presentation around the client, the customer, and then equity. So our customers come to us because they need help. They need help, number one, purchasing a vehicle, but then they don't know how to navigate some of these issues. So what we do at CHDC, I'm going to the next slide, is we assist customers to make sound financial decisions. So how do we do this? When we meet with a client, we look at where they want to go. Do they have a vision? Do they have a goal? How are they planning around this? Because it's one thing to give someone a loan, but it's another thing to assist them through the process. What we found is most of the customers who come to us either don't have bank accounts or do have bank accounts, but they don't know how to navigate getting a loan, being responsible with the loan. So what we do is we set up a way to assist them. So our process is to do a full-blown profile for the client. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all. What we do have is we tailor our needs-based approach to every customer. So what does that look like? So our customer is someone who is single mom, 2.5 kids, commutes to work, doesn't have a reliable transportation. So their goal of coming to us is to, okay, I want to purchase a vehicle because I don't have a reliable vehicle. Okay, so they go through the application process, and part of our process to do a soft pull on their credit, give them the one-on-one counseling. We ask them for bank statements because we want to know how they are currently spending their money. Do they have a roadmap? Do they have a monthly budget? How are they going to pay for this vehicle? Is this just another expense that we add into the household, or can they actually afford it? So we do an in-depth of their income versus their expenses and how much loan they can actually afford. And centering all this is around equity, because we want to make sure that our low income and dark families, they're able to afford this new technology, but we want to make sure that whatever loan that we give them, they can pay for the loan. So, I'm changing my slides. Bear with me, I'm having technical issues. Can you see my screen that says money management, Raquel?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. So with this is what we go through with the client. So when the client comes to us, we have a one-on-one counseling with them. So the one-on-one counseling will take anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, sometimes two, depending on the client. You know, our typical client has a credit score of about 600. So going to a bank, credit score 600, they may end up with an interest rate of maybe 20 to 25% to purchase a loan. So we do the one-on-one on counseling. We do a soft pull on their credit. Look at what they currently owe. Why are they having these credit challenges? So we try to answer where they've been, where they're going, and how we can help them get there. If they don't have a monthly budget, we help them with a monthly budget. If they don't have a savings account, we encourage them to work with a bank. We currently work with Travis Credit Union, who would assist them to become members and start a savings account. And that's how they get their loan. And if they need credit, you know, the 8% for someone who would ordinarily get 25% interest rate, 8% is a very good rate. But coupled with that 8%, we need to make sure that they're getting the counseling they need to be able to maintain the loan. Otherwise, if something happens and they lose that 8%, then they're back into predatory lending of maybe 20 to 25%. So the goal of what we're doing is to educate and counsel low income. Not all of them need the counseling, but most of them need it. And with the needs-based approach, it's very, very time consuming and it's very labor intensive because we spend a lot of time with the participants from the time they come to us and the time they purchase the vehicle. We helping them with the vehicle selection, looking at their lifestyle. Yes, you commute from Fairfield to San Francisco. is the Nissan Leaf the better way for you, or is there something that maybe a plugin will do? And if a plugin will do, how much is the plugin? Are you able to afford it? So these are some of the questions we come up as we talking to these our participants. We ask them these questions to be able to assist them navigate to, because we don't want them to be in a situation where they have the loan and all of a sudden something happens and they feel like, okay, I bought a BEV and now I need to go all the way to San Jose because I changed jobs and I don't know what to do. Or maybe, my family dynamic changed and I cannot afford this loan anymore. So we work with lenders and let them know that, this is something we need to do. This is outside the lending criteria. So we let them know that if something happens, if life happens, call us so that we can work with the lenders. Lenders meaning Travis Credit Union. That Travis Credit Union is our preferred lender. Let's talk to them, see if we can give you time, maybe a month or two to get your stuff together so that you can go back and pay the loan. Because at the end of the day, you wanted this vehicle to help you achieve a goal, sustaining your family, and we don't want to come back and take the vehicle away from you. So with the needs-based approach, we learned a lot of lessons. So the main thing we learned from our customers was we found out they had no knowledge of the technology. That was number one, and then financial services. Either they don't trust the banks or they don't know how to approach a bank or what to do to get a loan. That's one thing. Another thing we found out from them was a range anxiety. Using a BEV, you have to plan your day. You cannot just get in the vehicle and start driving. You have to charge the vehicle. You have to know where you're going. You have to know where the charging stations are. Running this program from 2015 until now, we found out that most of the limitations our customers have is charging stations where they live. They don't have a lot of charging stations in multifamily dwellings. They can't charge at home. They have to depend on commercial charges, which is great. They get $1,000 in charge card to charge, but sometimes when you get there, somebody's already using it, or there is a problem with safety where if they have a BEV, then they have to leave their vehicle at the charging station for 6-7 hours, take Uber or Lyft, go home and come back. There are safety concerns, vandalism. So these are things that they worry about. And then the time away from home trying to charge these vehicles. So as we talk to customers, we let them know that these are all challenges that we're working through. It will get better, but they need to give us time to work through some of these. So my advice to CARB and everyone involved in making this great for everyone, centering equity, is to ensure that we have the resources the low-income families need to support them to be able to adopt this technology, use the technology, because that's where California is going, and we don't want to leave them behind, because without this technology, they don't have the education. It will be very, very difficult to navigate. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Vivian. We're going to open it up to see if there are any clarifying questions on what Vivian presented. Aria, do you see any raised hands?
I do not.
I don't see anything in the Q&A box at the moment. Okay. Well, thank you again, Vivian. Right now, I think what we'll do is take our 10-minute break. Folks stretch, get water, do what you need to do, and we'll reconvene back at 2:45 and begin our panel discussion. All right, I think most of us are back from that short break. Now we're going to move into the second half of the agenda for today's workshop, starting with a panel discussion on ZEV market sustainability. And so I'd ask, if possible, if our panelists could turn their cameras on, and then we will use the questions that are on page 2 of the agenda to help guide this discussion. Okay, so we'll go with the first one. As we've seen, electric vehicles are a high priority for the administration and the legislature. And today we've heard a lot about what's to come. Of these efforts, what should the state prioritize when it comes to supporting the EV market and consumer awareness efforts, and why? And I'll leave it open to any of the panelists that want to jump in and answer that question.
I'll jump in. So this is Liz from Recurrent, and I would say that point of sale incentives and rebates, point of sale rebates on used EVs would be on my wish list. I think that would attract an entirely, and I know that California does offer those to certain populations, but I think really investing in those programs would open the consumer pool a lot.
And I guess I would say kind of a little bit broader than that. I mean, I think everything that we've talked about is important. And it's kind of like when you go to buy a car and they say, this salesperson says, okay, what's your priority, a steering wheel or a brake? Well, I kind of want both. And it's the same way, if we want to transform the market, if we want to get to where I think everybody wants to go, we need everything. We need the infrastructure at all homes, and at homes, and in all homes, not just at single family homes. We need it at workplaces, we need it at public locations, we need hydrogen, we need level 2 chargers, DC fast chargers. We need vehicles and vehicles in all category, like we've talked about. We need fuel prices that are competitive with or lower than gasoline prices. The critical minerals, battery processing, production facilities, we need all of that. And of course, we need the consumers. I think we've touched on that. And one of the things that we'd recommended was fleet purchase requirements and things like rental car fleets, so that people can test this technology out. I mean, it's a big purchase by virtually every consumer. And it is until you've driven an EV, which I've owned one for many years, and you see how they fit your lifestyle. I think to the extent rental car companies had these in their fleets, people could test it out. They could see, does it fit my lifestyle? Can I use this? And they could do so without making that $20, $30, $40, $50,000 commitment. So those are, again, the incentives are important, and new and used. But I think California is doing a pretty good job covering all these spaces. But we really do need everything to make this full transition.
Yeah, I agree. It's a holistic approach for sure, and maybe some of the policy measures not mentioned, like the aggressive goals and those sorts of things play a part as well. I would say that COVID has kind of brought my attention back to one, which is, there's this old saying by the guy who developed the EV1 that automaking seemed to be all about cost, and cup holders. And if I were to sort of echo back the themes I've heard in today's talks, I've heard a lot about price, awareness, assistance, and infrastructure. And those are kind of the nutrients that the market needs to survive. And without any one of them, it'll die. But, you don't necessarily need a ton of all of them, But I think price is important, and it's because of COVID, right? Like batteries got a lot cheaper, but first those savings were invested in more batteries, giving the cars a longer range to get over range anxiety. And then even then battery EVs started looking like they were going to, slide down that curve towards affordability, and COVID hit, and the prices have, Tesla has officially declared they're kind of out of the business of sliding down that cost curve now. And so price is a problem these days. And so that's kind of more at the front of my mind than others, but I agree that it's kind of a holistic approach. Before we start seeing actual price reductions, as a result of those cost savings that may be happening.
Building on that, Brett, thanks everyone. I think that just considering the clear demand for clean vehicles among low-income communities and the state's goal is to really make an equitable shift towards clean vehicles, I think that in the near term, with the limited supply of EVs in the market and the high costs, that it's worth considering just the higher financial needs, so higher incentive amounts to truly support low-income communities, especially those most burdened by pollution, high commute times, and just general economic disadvantages. I think that stacking is helpful, and that we've seen that like 9,500 amount makes a huge difference, and especially when folks are not really seeing viable used options, which is unfortunately currently the state.
I will add to that investing in infrastructure and public charging infrastructure in particular does make older and lower range EVs a lot more plausible for low and middle income shoppers. If you know that you can charge near work, even if you don't work in even if your work is not a location that would traditionally have a charger, then it makes it a lot more approachable.
Thank you guys all for that input. So the variety of available EVs in different vehicle classes does not yet mirror that of the internal combustion engine market. How important is diversity among vehicle options, and when can we expect auto manufacturers to produce a larger number of affordable EVs in various vehicle classes?
So I guess I can start this off. I think model diversity within the different classes is important. I think that you're seeing manufacturers enter all of the different segments. There is kind of a saturation point, so 2 is twice as good as 1, but maybe 40 isn't twice as good as 20. There's at some point, but of course manufacturers will head to the market where the most demand is. And I think you see some of that. Again, I think, when you look at where automakers go, they go to where the customers are. And so you see things like the Mach-E, the Ioniq 5, the Kia EV6, those are all headed towards the small SUV, which is currently one of the most popular segments. And you'd also see, Ford, GM, Tesla, Rivian, all entering the pickup truck market. So that's coming too. As for affordability, that's a problem kind of across the board, both with internal combustion vehicles as well as electric vehicles. The average new car price right now is well over $45,000, and the average transaction price for an electric vehicle that hit $64,000 last month. And I think there's a number of things going into those price increases, and those are all way up. One is the raw material prices. They've been trending up for the last year. They've really spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine. I think they shut down the nickel market a couple of weeks ago when prices jumped 250% in 2 days. And the same thing, lithium prices have been trending up. I don't know exactly how much they're up, but it's a lot over the last year. They've been trending up. Cobalt, same thing. So those are pushing on it. Inflation just in general, and of course supply chain, particularly the chips shortage has reduced the availability of chips for vehicles and chips for electric vehicles. So I think the affordability for right now and probably for the next few years, and again, I'm not, not an economist or, and I don't have any inside information into the automakers, but I think it's safe to say that the price of all vehicles is probably going to be fairly high for the next, for the next year or something like that.
And it's worth mentioning how many more semiconductors are required for an electric vehicle as opposed to an internal combustion engine. I think it's somewhere between 10 to 100 times more. I forgot how many zeros are on there. But in terms of resource allocation for a car manufacturer, that would be something I would think about too.
Right, great. And we've touched a lot on price today. Data does show that used EV prices are on the rise and that a percentage of used EVs do end up out of state. How can our incentive programs adjust to continue and expand support of the used EV market in California while prioritizing funding for lower income car buyers? And how can we make changes to our current incentives portfolio to help keep these EVs in California?
I believe that increasing the incentives is critical because we've had customers who come to us and they have, let's say, 4 or 5 children, an average of between 3 and 4 children, and they cannot fit them in a Chevy Bolt. So they want like a van. So the Chrysler Pacifica comes to mind. And we've had 2 or 3 people purchase Chrysler Pacificas, and those are not cheap. They're ranging in 40,000. So when you have a low-income family who wants to adapt to the technology, wants that van but cannot afford it because the incentive is so low, then all of a sudden equity goes out of the door because they are not able to take advantage of the same benefits as someone who can afford it. So case in point, we had a client 2 days ago who's purchasing a vehicle, and he kept on calling us to tell us the incentive is so low. You need to increase the grant. You need to increase the grant. I said, no, we cannot increase the grant. The grant is set at 5,000, and that's all you get. So either we then go back to the drawing board, look at your expenses and see where we can cut so that you can be able to afford this, but we can't just increase the grant. So as vehicles are getting more expensive and very rare to find, they're going over 4,000 to 5,000 over Blue Book. The incentives need to rise to meet that. And that's very important.
I think affordability is key. I think quantifying that leakage is important to understanding what we need to do in addition to affordability. I think, there's kind of this hope or wish I would have that we wouldn't have to go and settle with good enough, that we could get stackable incentives that would get everybody into a new EV, right? If there's more like, I don't know if a phone's a good example or not, but wouldn't that be better? There'd be less concern about degradation. There'd be less concern about kind of saddling somebody with outdated technology. And so I think we need to kind of put some bumpers just to make sure that's not happening. Recurrent might be able to give a stamp of confidence better than this, but is my personal comfort level might be model year 2015 and older vehicles. Let's just kind of take them out of the picture. And data can inform what those recommendations should really be. Let's make sure new incentives are producing affordable used incentives. So the MSRP cap does help with that. We have some dynamics in the new car market that are unfortunate, which is, the used market is twice as big. We saw that 70%, of the cars are used, and half of Californians don't even buy new cars, but 16% of Californians are buying half of the new cars, generating all of those used cars. So how do we deal with that reality? It's a tricky one. So we got to make sure the pipeline that births the used EVs is robust, but also producing the affordable EVs, the reliable EVs that people want to get into, and get them as close to that near new as possible, so that some of the concerns that Recurrent and others can't kind of give us the stamp of confidence against are minimized, and we can get people into the best option for them possible.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I joined late. I was at another meeting, but on the topic of used vehicles, I know the question asks about incentive programs, but something that we might also want to keep in mind is the role of industry in incentivizing and supporting the used vehicle market. For example, Toyota, with the Mirai, the hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, a certified pre-owned Mirai does come with like a 3-year fuel card, I believe. And it's in the company's interest to have their cars on the road, to have them, visible and out there and on there for a number of years, to have a customer base for them to be visible, and also to collect data. And so it's, that's an incentive that is from the industry on used vehicles rather than from the state.
Guys, for that insight. We have heard today about the various population groups that have yet to adopt EVs at the same rate as other population groups in California. So what are some plans? Are there plans to target future outreach to these groups? And what are some other ways that we can better target outreach through either larger efforts like statewide, such as Velos, or through our incentive programs? And I'll pose this more to our program administrators and possibly GoBiz and get some insight there.
I can start off here. So the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, we've, over the last several years, been working to build a strong statewide network of community partners. We've coordinated closely with Access Clean California, and we've conducted outreach strategies such as ride and drive events and Spanish social media campaigns. And these efforts have proven to engage low-income consumers and DAC communities. But often, and really what we've seen, unfortunately, is that because these consumers tend to take a little bit more time to learn about the program or need a little bit more like coaching or assistance with the online application, that they end up at the end of the line. And so we've been operating the program as a first come, first serve program. But we're really excited to be working with CARB, and thank you everyone who's been participating in these work groups to think through how to shift away from a first come, first serve model towards a model that will really ensure that priority applicants are first in line. I think this will be so important to ensuring this equitable transition and recognizing that there is always going to be a limitation on our funding to make sure that the funding is going to those who stand to benefit the most. And what we've learned in our outreach pilot, as I mentioned, and through our other outreach efforts, is just that the timeline flexibility can be really key, because some folks need a vehicle really urgently, while other folks need much more time to build up their credit and work through the budgeting process. And so to Vivian's presentation, the one size fits all model doesn't always work. And I think that just that timeline flexibility, increased incentive amounts for certain individuals, coupled with these statewide networks that we're all building and hopefully coordinating, will be really important.
I'd also love to talk a little bit about the ZEV consumer awareness, ZEV consumer awareness grants that GoBiz has just made. In fact, I was executing grant agreements this morning, if I may. For one, it's a drop in the ocean, right? We got an allocation of 5 million, a one-time amount to make a ZEV consumer awareness grant. When we put out the RFP, the request for proposals, we specified that we will be prioritizing those that are reaching priority communities and those that are well defined, right? In evaluating proposals, we looked at, can you clearly define which people you're serving? Are you, doing rural outreach to people who are farm workers and they're commuting, to go work, or are you reaching out to moderate income urban professionals? So we looked at how are you defining who you're reaching rather than just trying to bucket, the kind of generalized low income or marginalized population. So we looked at that, and oh goodness, and also I found my train of thought. I lost it and then I found it. This $5 million to make grants, and we got a lot of applications requesting more than 5 times that amount, and there's a huge need out there. And what was good, I mean, I wish we could fund everybody, but what we at least learned a lot, even from those that we weren't able to fund, there were people doing outreach through schools, for example, and people doing outreach through employers, and a lot of multiple strategies that complement one another. So you can have your big media buys, right? You can be like, okay, we're going to partner with, Spanish language media, and we're going to have really clear messaging, or we're going to do local messaging, and we're going to have, a spokesperson outside the local shop talking about his EV. And, we saw that kind of advertising outreach approach. There also is the pipeline, right? So what is somebody's first point of contact with a zero emission vehicle or with somebody who has one? And then what is the next step? And what is the next step after that? And this kind of does bring us to question 5, right? Of what are the chain of steps from somebody's first bit of messaging about a zero emission vehicle to, okay, how do I get one? Can I afford one? Can I charge it? Can I fuel it? And do I know somebody else who drives one? And, they're interesting beyond the ride and drive models. There were creative financing and leasing models. There were prolonged test drives, right? Not just driving a lap around a parking lot, but having customer support and driving one for a couple of weeks. And so we really learned a lot about the ideas that people want to implement to reach out to those who have yet to adopt ZEVs in a big way. Given that we had well over 25 million in requests and only 5 million to allocate, I hope that there'll be more resources put to this purpose.
I think kind of echoing some of that, I kind of have 2 thoughts on this. One is sort of what I think I know, and the other is what I've learned. And, kind of the point of my talk was to inform outreach strategies in some sense, to quantify the where we are and whether we are attending, so we better can judge what to do and how to do it. And I hope some of that is useful. But what I've learned from folks who are actually doing outreach is the value of asking, not presuming, but asking, engaging with CBOs, saying, what do you need? And I think, folks like Lori Walker on the Cbrp team and folks on this call and your colleagues that are good at doing that, asking and listening and figuring out, well, the best laid plans may be informed by this strategy, and it can be targeted and tailored. It can be these 3 things, but what do you need? And that's where the real discoveries are, a lot of the interesting stuff comes from too.
You reminded me of another thing I forgot to add, and that is in making these consumer awareness grants, we specifically encouraged collaborative proposals. So people who are working through partnerships, including community-based organizations, industry, local government, and it's been really helpful to see the partnerships that emerge from that, have an on the ground, in the community kind of presence that can support those who maybe have, the expertise and the resources, but not the local knowledge.
I wanted to add was what has worked for us was going to the places where the people we need to adopt these vehicles are. So for instance, we partnered with social services, but most of these people go to social services for one thing or the other. So we do workshops through social services where if they have caseworkers, we present to caseworkers. So if they have clients who are in need of a vehicle, they just found a job, they don't have a vehicle, they take in buses, then they refer them to us, or they gather a lot of people together and we do We tailor the workshops to them. Of course, when it comes to the one-on-one counseling, we do it since credit is involved and we don't want to share people's financial information in a web group setting. We do it more of, okay, we're giving you a general overview. Now call us so that we can have a more in-depth one-on-one counseling tailored to you specifically. So going to the social services, partnering with multi-family dwellings. We've done presentations at Abode Housing, EAH, where they have a lot of people who are in need. And when they go to the website, to Jonah's point, they end up at the bottom of the line, and they are the ones who are in need. So what can we do to ensure that we are putting them first instead of somebody who wants a vehicle versus somebody who doesn't have a vehicle at all? Or someone who already has a vehicle, but I want to drive an EV, but this person over here doesn't have a vehicle at all, but you're first in line. So what do I do? Then I'm going to help this one who doesn't have any vehicle before I assist you because you already have a vehicle.
Yeah, all great points. Thank you, Vivian, for touching on that and hearing more of the perspective from the people who are coming through the program too. As you've focused a lot of your presentation on, that more hands-on case management approach to incentives seems to have a positive impact and increases EV uptake, particularly among lower income car buyers. So how can we take what we've learned so far about this approach and apply it to our larger statewide EV purchase incentive efforts?
It takes a lot of resources. It will take a lot of resources because hand-holding is not easy. At the end of the day, you want to assist someone get to the goal they want to do, but we don't decline anybody coming through the program. It's not a practice to decline anyone. So when we do the counseling and we look at your budget and we know that you cannot afford a vehicle, we address that with you and let you know that, okay, you may want to reduce your expenses if you can, or increase your income because a vehicle will cost you about $300-400 more every month. How are you going to pay for that? So if it's not within your budget, we explain it to you and say, no, we're going to hold on to your application, come back to maybe you need to work on paying down some of these credit cards. Create a snowball where you're taking the least amount you owe, pay that off, and then apply the funds to the next one and pay it off so that you will have that cushion to be able to afford this vehicle. Because coming from, I used to have work in a bank, and mostly the first thing that goes when somebody gets into dire strait is the vehicle. They start paying the vehicle first. So if we've done our job right, we would ensure that they have that savings cushion so that if something happens, they can fall on the savings first before letting the vehicle go. Because once a vehicle goes, they lose their job, they may lose their housing, and then all of a sudden it becomes, a snowball effect or a domino effect, I should say. So it all ties into what are we doing to engage these customers to be financially responsible, to be able to, manage their money, manage their credit, and manage the vehicle they just acquired.
Something that we've heard from groups who are doing this more hands-on case management type approach is the importance of pulling together different incentives that are coming from different sources. So are there a couple of different vehicle incentives that you can layer on? Can you also get an incentive for home charging, or can you get some kind of fuel incentive? And people might have to otherwise look in several different places because these incentives might come from different sources. And if there's a way to pull that information together, kind of wrap around a person and make sure that they have access to all of those different incentives that they need to put the pieces together, that seems to be helpful. On the question of, further learning, I've already mentioned the ZEV consumer awareness grants that are going to be implemented from now through the end of May 2023. GoBiz was able to fund 2 of them, one to Veloz and one to Valley Clean Air Now. And Valley Clean Air Now is one of those more case management type programs, or they have one, those programs. And one thing we're doing in implementing the grant is actually building into the process a chance to learn. And so it's, going beyond just, okay, here's how I spent my money, here's what I did, but actually incorporating in the grant agreement, okay, we're going to have a time throughout the grant period to come together and talk and actually have the different grantees talk to one another about what's working and how their approaches can complement one another. So we really look forward to seeing what comes out of that.
I love this
Before we-
question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll chime in quickly on this. It's such an important question. It's definitely been very top of mind for me and my team. And we've been talking with Vivian and other program administrators because this feels like a really, a really important question right now. And one thing to add to the conversation is just that from our experience working with a range of participants is that, some people really, their biggest hurdle is the computer, like computer literacy, access to internet. And so that's one form of assistance needed. Vivian's example highlighted another category that we see of just folks really needing assistance with being ready for the loan, understanding that process, and just the financial coaching and support. So that, like the technical stuff, the financial stuff, and then there's the whole dealership experience, which can be really hard and overwhelming, and no one wants to be an expert in that. Sorry if you are, but most consumers don't need to know how to navigate dealerships for their daily life. It just comes up occasionally. And so I think that's another area where that assistance is really important to ensure that they get a good deal. And so just seeing those 3 different buckets of assistance needed, there's probably more, but those ones really have come up most in our experiences. I think it's fair to assume that not everyone is going to need all 3 in the same depth. And so I think it will be important for us to build flexible models where we can get to know our participants and which type of assistance is most important to them. And of course, if all 3 is necessary, those pathways should be available. But I think just in terms of thinking about limited resources, I think building programs that are flexible to meet people where they're at and direct them to the resources and also the programs that best fit their needs is going to be important. So just really recognizing the importance of coordination across programs. And again, I keep saying flexibility I think is really important. Flexible pathways, flexible timelines, flexible grant amounts, and that I think will make the best use of the limited funding. But just another note on the funding is just that I think the programs that are currently doing the highest amount of case management are really the least funded in CARB's portfolio. So I think that just additional funding, as Vivian pointed out, this is really resource intensive work. And so additional funding is necessary to scale it.
So before we turn over and open it up to participants to ask comments and ask questions and make some comments on today's material, I just wanted to give the panelists one last opportunity if they want to provide any additional thoughts on the questions here we have discussed or what we've talked about today.
Just one additional comment on the affordability. The board, has made changes to the Cbrp program that eliminate the lowest price, most affordable vehicle. In 2020, so I think December of 2020, they eliminated every vehicle that cost under $30,000. And that was based on the range of the vehicle. But, in this case, one vehicle was the cheapest, the lowest cost vehicle was $26,000, the Kia Niro, and it had a 29-mile range. the cutoff was 30 miles. And so I think, that's certainly the prerogative of the board to decide that, but I do think it is worth considering how those decisions impact the affordability of vehicles.
Well, thank you all for your input on those questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we're going to turn it over to participants. And Aria, if there are any raised hands, we'll start lining up those questions and comments.
Yeah, there are a few raised hands, but just as a reminder, please state your name and affiliation when I've unmuted your mic. If you're joining by phone, and it doesn't look like we have any phone people on phone, but if you have friends who are calling in, please raise your hand by pressing the pound or #2 on your phone. And if you're joining by computer or mobile phone, please mark the raised hand feature at the bottom of your screen. With that, we have 2 raised hands. Sorry, 3 raised hands. First up, we have Mark Roost. Mark, I have unmuted your mic.
Thank you. Mark Roost, Sustainable Energy, Inc., and I'm an advisor for the Silicon Valley Clean Cities Coalition. And I've got a bigger idea for this, which is, particularly since there are issues with the rising cost of lithium and there are issues with reaching people with affordability of what manufacturers choose to make. So what if the state and mission capitalists, shall we say, get together and do joint ventures to develop new vehicles using designs from somebody, for instance, who founded the advanced vehicle design industry in Southern California, and did a world car design for Ford, and Ford chose not to use it because it wasn't designed the way they do their things, but it was actually designed for people in India. But we can, the Rocky Mountain Institute has the hypercar. There's plenty of things that can be done, and there's plenty of niche groups that are skilled at design that could partner with the state to build electric vehicles and the state would fund it or finance it or whatever, and to build electric vehicles that are suited to the needs that we're talking about here, that are all electric, that are long range or short range, depending on what the person needs. And then along with that, also fund a conversion industry. So there's a few companies doing conversions, and one of them is focused on trucks and buses, and others could maybe focused on consumer vehicles. But so Kate Gordon, who was the head of the Office of Planning and Research under Newsom, in 2001, she ran a program on the new Apollo program, and that was about getting people to paying for people to be trained in the disadvantaged communities to do upgrades and installations, and that could be applied to converting vehicles as well, doing all of the above. So it's like, if capitalism has some biases that tend to vacuum the money upstream, turn that around. Partner with people who want to do it differently, but have the skills of capitalism.
Thank you for those comments, Mark.
You're welcome.
Do I have a moment to chime in briefly, or? I just want to thank you for that comment and mention, at GoBiz, a lot of the stakeholders we talk to are businesses that are maybe early stage or startup or looking to scale, that have prototypes. And we see a lot of really fascinating, huge variety of vehicles coming our way, and people who are trying to find a way to make them and to sell them. Also small businesses who want to do conversions, like you just talked about. If there's people who have a classic car and they want to preserve, the body of the car, but maybe convert it to either battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. So a lot of these innovative people, they're out there already. We're talking to some of them, and we're trying to put together the pieces through grants, through incubator programs, through tax incentives, you know, the whole array of things, and that's where navigating the services maybe can become easier. That's what we try to do. So those people are out there. I'm sure you know that. That's probably why you brought it up. But
Well,
I
I brought it up. I actually brought it up because I've been designing that sort of thing for 20 years in my head. Okay, which person was that was just speaking? Because I only see 4 people and none of you were moving your lips. So who is it?
Sorry, this is Courtney from GoBiz.
Courtney from GoBiz. Okay, thank you. Can I get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can email, like we have a general email inbox, zev@gobiz.ca.gov. And folks who are looking to kind of get a foothold for their business, if you have a zero emission vehicle related business idea, you know, it takes a while to get on our calendar. We're very busy, but we do appreciate hearing from folks like you.
So zev@gobiz.gov.
gobiz.ca.gov.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I worked for Amory Levin, so I want to bite on that piece of it, but I'll resist. And one of the themes that the comments resonated with was just this whole theme of workforce development, right? And the opportunities, whether it's for one thing or another, whether it's for infrastructure, whether it's for making sure utilities and automakers have sufficient workforce to rise to the challenge of smart grids and electric vehicles. I think, you know, there is some activity that's coalescing around that's been going on over the last few years. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but just kind of, you know, further ringing that workforce development bell a little bit.
Thank you, everyone. Next up, we have Evan Edgar. Evan, I've unmuted your mic.
Thank you. My name is Evan Edgar at Edgar Associates. We do a lot of sustainability reporting, greenhouse gas inventories, and a lot of systems we do are circular economy, making out of short-lived climate pollutants. We convert all the organics over to renewable natural gas, and then we put it back into the vehicles, and we make organic compost out of the digestate. So we do a lot of circular economy, a lot of sustainability, and today's agenda says market sustainability. And what's missing from this conversation is a true sustainability of producing electric batteries. There's a lot of reports out about that. The European Commission in consultation right now is trying to shape the future of green energy, where they want to have a battery regulation that would require all businesses and battery industry to report on their social and environmental impact of their operations. That would ensure that the batteries entering the EU for electric cars would come from socially responsible sources and sustainable. And we're talking about sustainability today, and what's missing is where does this mineral come from on the supply chain, from the cobalt in Africa to the lithium in South America, where all those minerals are being sourced in an unsustainable manner. Huge environmental impacts to not only the land, but to the people. So as you have this discussion about market sustainability, the panel is great. I learned a lot today, but what is not being talked about is what is the sustainability of getting the minerals out of these areas with such social disruption and environmental disruption. I would like to have a workshop on that if you're going to be talking about sustainability, and nobody brought that up today. I was disappointed. Maybe that's not the scope of the workshop, but it says sustainability. Let's talk about sustainability in its true sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, great point, and happy to get those comments. Unfortunately, that isn't really the scope of today. We are really just focused on the car market here in California and what we can do to make sure that we're getting the cleanest cars available to consumers, and what it looks like and how we look at that market and how we kind of plan for the incentives that we have and how we use those incentives within the programs that we've created. But again, a very important comment, and one that I know at different levels throughout the state that we are still exploring.
No, you're not. Clean cars are not clean with dirty. Nobody, I keep on bringing it up, but nobody answers it. So I haven't seen it brought up anywhere within CARB. So clean cars cannot come from dirty operations, and sustainability is real. So I would remove the sustainability comment from your agenda, because there's no sustainability really going on here with regards to battery production. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, Evan. Next up, we have Jonathan Changus. Jonathan, I have unmuted your mic.
Hi, thanks, Aria. Jonathan Changus again with the Center for Sustainable Energy, and wanted to kind of provide some perspective and get some feedback from the panelists today on a couple of different bits. And, you know, traditionally when we participate in these CARB workshops, it's under the mantle of Cbrp, which is a program we administer, but we're also supporting SAC Metro Clean Cars for All as a case manager. We are also a subcontractor and have the pleasure of working with BSF and Jonah on the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program. We also run a non-CARB program, which is the pre-owned EV rebate for Southern California Edison. And so one of the things that California does exceptionally well so far is recognize the need for different types of market interventions and has a real rich history of trying to figure out how to encourage adoption and the types of services needed across the consumer market. And that's the really good news. And I think though that there's some lessons learned too about how we can kind of calibrate going forward. And we've talked a lot about this idea of stackable programs. And that is good in that there is a larger incentive available for folks that really need the assistance. It's challenging though when the programs have had such fluctuating funding. Wait lists are a killer. Some resources are available and then they're not. Sometimes the wait lists are quite lengthy, as we've seen in different times. And that kind of inconsistency, which is not, I mean, that's a challenge in the past where we didn't have enough funding. The legislature did a tremendous job, I thought, last year, and what's being proposed again by the governor this year should help address some of that with providing a lot more funding. But it would be, I think, worth exploring, and I'm curious what some folks' thoughts are about, instead of having to, you can get $4,500 from Cbrp for a battery electric vehicle, and you can get $5,000 from DCAP or a CVA program. Well, if we want to help that person get that $9,500, why couldn't we do it through one program? And I know there's a rich history and funding concerns in the past, but what we've seen and heard across the programs that we administer is the challenge of understanding who's eligible for which programs and the multiple channels that folks have to apply through. I think that simplifying the pathway for the consumers we're trying to reach would go a long way. The second piece, so that's my first, I'm curious to see how people respond to that. The second piece that I'm really interested in is, I love the focus today. We've heard a lot about the used EV market, but we don't have a used EV market now because we're not selling enough new EVs. I think maybe that's self-evident, but it feels like if we really want to create that robust used and secondary market, especially for lower income individuals, then we need a much larger new EV market first to kind of set the table. And so as we're thinking about how do we set the stage for the used market, I think we have to talk about a broader market and a broader, how are we going to encourage and facilitate a more robust new EV market first to help make that happen. And that may involve should that be focused exclusively on low income, middle class incentives so that we get the vehicles out into the market in the first place so that they're available for lower income households on the second. So that's the second comment that I'm curious to hear what our diverse and esteemed panelists have to say on that. Thank you.
So I'm happy to hop in about the used EV market. And I think, I don't have all these numbers calculated off the top of my head, but I think given the disparity between new and used car ownership in this country, I'm not sure how much further, and I'm sure there is still some room, but I'm not sure how much further we can push on the new EV market before new car buyers are kind of used up. So I think that's point one. And then point two is also, given the supply chain issues right now, we know that there are a lot of shoppers who traditionally buy new cars who, particularly Tesla shoppers with the wait list for Teslas. And also we saw that with Mach-E's last year. New car buyers who turn towards the used market, people get amped up and they get level 2 chargers at home and they're excited about going electric. And a lot of them are turning to the used market now too. So it's additional pressure for sort of higher end and newer EVs on the used market.
I can try to harken back to the first part of that two-part question. At the beginning of today, I talked about the 4 pillars of the zero emission vehicle market development strategy. One of those pillars being end users, and I was talking about the importance of connecting the end users with the vehicles that meet their needs. And it's, the ZEV team at GoBiz, we've adopted this as our mantra for the year. And one thing that we do is we coordinate with something like 28, 29 state agencies on annual action plans and reporting. And so everyone we're talking to, we're talking about how can things get better for the end user. And that's a whole variety of things. It can be getting the vehicle, it can be having, owning the vehicle, but also like charging, how can we make charging easier? Can there be, there's options that people are looking into, right? Like a single card you can use to pay for charging at multiple different kinds of stations, because a big obstacle for people right now is that your ability to charge might kind of depend on what network you use to find your charging stations, and they're all different and they have different apps and different ways that you can pay. And so that's one thing that we're really looking at, is just making that part of the experience easier. And can we look at every way that a person is interacting with their mobility, and is there a way to make that a little bit better? Whether it's making the incentives a little bit easier to bring them into one place when you buy the car, whether it's making it more universally easy to pay to charge. I think we're trying really hard to find those opportunities everywhere that they exist.
Yeah, and there are so many incentives and different incentive programs. I agree, Jonathan, to the first part of your question. I mean, there's CC4A, there's CVAP, there's the local air districts, the central or the San Joaquin Valley Drive Clean program, which offers money. I think other and I think ARB certainly attempts and tries to keep to make that as simple as possible. I think it's still probably fairly complicated if you stack those, because they add up to a lot of money. I mean, it's $20,000 probably, and that's not including the federal tax, which if you're low income, you may not have the tax liability to get that $7,500. And it's a bit of a dilemma, because there's $7,500 sitting on the table federally. But if you don't have that tax liability, then you just have to leave it on the table, because the alternative is to lease the vehicle, and then at the end of 3 years you don't have a car. And I don't think that's for lower income. I just don't think that's a great strategy. So I wish there were a way not to leave that $7,500 federal tax credit on the table, and maybe when they update it, if they update it, that will be so. But I agree, and like I said, I think in California, if you add up 4,500 plus 9,500 plus 3,000 for San Joaquin, assuming that those are all funded at the same time, plus another 750 for the clean fuel rewards, I mean, it adds up to a very large amount, and that could substantially reduce the cost of the vehicle. So, and again, I appreciate it. I think ARB has known about this, or CARB has known about this for a long time. They've really been trying for years.
Steve, you've muted yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think CARB has tried for many years to kind of pull all this together to make it easy. I think it's difficult, and I'm not sure exactly how that's turned out.
Yeah, Steve, thank you for those comments. And just to chime in from the CARB perspective, I think our ideal goal is to get to a place where it's a streamlined program that's a lot easier to access. So I think one of the key things that we hope to come out of this effort to update the long-term plan and these discussions we're having is to see how we can move our programs in that direction and eliminate overlap and confusion, and make it a lot easier to access, and moving things closer to the point of purchase, because we know that's where it's most effective.
Thank you, everyone. Next up, we have Christian Corby. Christian, I have unmuted your mic.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My name is Christian Corby, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the California Electric Transportation Coalition, or CALETC. So first, I wanted to thank all of the panelists for these great presentations today. There's a lot of really good information, lots of really good data, and I actually might have lost the panelist I was going to direct my question to, but I'll make it anyway, just for the purposes of discussion. So it looks like the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, CBRP, according to this data, it's showing that like in 2020, 66% of the funding went to households with incomes under 150,000. And my question was going to be, since we have reduced the income caps for this year, it went down to 135,000, and then next year it'll go down to 120,000. My question was going to be, how is that specific program change, and maybe some of the other ones that have been implemented, meant to achieve some of these kind of path forward metrics that CSE has put together? And I guess I'm just kind of interested to hear a little bit more narrative about how we're going to achieve these, because I really liked the data that came out of this, and the way that it was laid out. It seems like there is actually some really effective ways to try and get to that second layer of the onion to try to address some of these shortcomings in the market right now, as far as trying to reach more diverse people with our incentives, and people who really need the incentive, as opposed to people who would just take it if they could get it. So yeah, that was going to be my question. I do have to say again, I really appreciate everyone's presentations today. It was a very informative discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Next up, we have Mark Roost. Mark, I've unmuted your mic.
Thank you. Mark Roost, Sustainable Energy Inc. and Silicon Valley Clean Cities Coalition advisor. So referring to what Steve brought up, comprehensive design science teaches how to do this. Can we make it radically better? Solar canopies over parking, 70% of the stock is used, 30% will be used. So I have developed a concept strategy for converting those worth keeping based on knowing the guy that I mentioned earlier. And Eisenhower said, when you've got a challenge, you've got an intractable problem, make it bigger. So I would say that I would echo the value of the individual assessments people have done and the data that's been provided, but each one of them is thinking within a particular paradigm. And the thing that Bucky Fuller taught was get outside that, look at the whole system, and see from a position of comprehensive design science thinking how that whole system can be changed. And that's what we really need to do. We need to change the entire system. And that's why I brought up the idea of a state partnership. Is create policy based on what science demands and what people need and what the environment calls for. But one other thing is that the battery issue that guy raised about sustainability, it's true about lithium batteries, but saline batteries that are made with ceramic ingredients as metal oxide alloys instead of purified metals can get around those, because those are commodity materials that are used to make pottery, and the machinery and the factories that make the pottery are extremely high performance, extremely reliable, and extremely inexpensive to buy. So that's a business strategy there. So there are lots of ways to get around and beyond these stalemates that we're at now. That's my specialty. I've only been working on it for about 60 years. So I'd like to talk to anybody who wants to work with that.
So this is something that GoBiz we often find ourselves in conversations like this because we are kind of a liaison between, business and industry and government. And a lot of our conversations are from people who have an idea or a technology that they haven't seen mentioned in a regulation or a grant program. And they're like, hey, were you aware of this technology? And we're trying to be a bridge. This is happening a lot right now, for example, with hydrogen. And I mentioned at the beginning of the day, long ago at this point, that one of our underlying principles is multiple pathways to our goals. And so we are open to conversations of like, oh, we heard about a company that now has a good substitute for cobalt, or we've got a company that has a new green way to make hydrogen that isn't just electrolysis. And can we then bring this into our work in the state so that these pathways are factored into our initiatives and our programs and our regulations. I can't claim to be an expert in these individual things. I just know that as GoBiz kind of spanning business and state, that's the kind of conversation we're often in.
Great, thank you, Courtney. I'm done now.
Thank you, Mark. Aria, before we move on, I did want to circle back to the questions and comments that Christian Corby raised. I don't think we actually got to them and then we moved on to the next speaker. So I did kind of want to address some of the comments he brought up about, the changes, the phased in plan of changes we have for Cbrp and how, this data that was presented today, how we can take that into account going forward and making sure that what we're doing, the changes we're making to the program don't have an overall negative impact on the EV market. And, when we developed that plan last year, the market looked different, the economy looked different. And, now we're revisiting a lot of that, and we'll have further discussions in a CBRP specific work group as to what changes do make sense going forward to CBRP, given what we know now, what the economy looks like, what EV inventory and prices look like. So I do want to note that we are definitely revisiting that plan, and we'll be discussing that further with stakeholders. Do we have any other raised hands, Aria?
We do not.
I think you're muted.
Thank you. I'm pressing the space button over here and it's on the wrong thing. So now that it looks like we've kind of wrapped up questions for now, I'm just going to go over some closing comments and give folks some time if they have additional feedback they want to make either verbally or in the Q&A box. But I just want to thank everyone again for the great discussion, and many thanks to our panelists today and for all of the great information that they provided. Again, the recording for this workshop will be available on the Low Carbon Transportation Meetings and Workshop page and within the next 2 weeks. And all the presentations from today are available there as well. We do have a number of project-specific work groups planned over the next 6 weeks or so. So please make sure that you are subscribed to our GovDelivery listserv. We'll drop a link to that in the chat for those of you who would like to sign up, or you can click on the subscribe link on our Low Carbon Transportation Investments homepage on the CARB website. With regards to the effort to update the long-term plan for light-duty vehicles, we do have one more workshop plan, which we hope to hold in late May. And the focus of that third workshop will be to take what we've learned so far and discuss how we can make changes to our purchase incentives to make them easier and to access and understand. So we'll be providing some updates on our current efforts underway to improve the consumer experience and increase partnerships with community-based organizations. We'll also be taking suggestions from stakeholders on the directions these programs should be taking in the longer term. Additionally, the second long-term plan work group for mobility investments is anticipated to be held on April 19th. Further details will be released soon, but if you do have any questions about the mobility investments portion, of the long-term plan, please contact my colleague Ashley Giorgio, who is leading that portion of the long-term plan, and I will drop her email address in the chat for those who need it. And with regards to project-specific working groups, one is planned for April 11th from 5 to 7 p.m. to discuss the statewide expansion of Clean Cars for All. Additional information and a link to the Zoom meeting registration can be found on the Low Carbon Transportation Investments website. We also plan on holding a work group in late April to discuss Cbrp, updated Cbrp projections and any changes that need to be made to that phase-in plan of changes that were approved by the board in November. Additional working groups will also be scheduled to discuss implementing a needs-based approach for the statewide financing assistance program. And again, the best way to get information on any of these meetings is to subscribe to our listserv and to check our Low Carbon Transportation Investments homepage. So I'll be dropping links in the chat right now to the listserv, as well as dropping contact information for my colleague who is leading the mobility portion of the long-term plan. And so thank you all again for your participation and the great discussion that we've had today. One last check, Aria, are there any questions or raised hands?
So we do have a comment from Mark Roost that the chat is disabled and no information has been shown, but I think that you'll be doing that in a second. So other than that, we don't have any raised hands or questions in the Q&A box.
Well, thank you again, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the week.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.